Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we're going somewhere quiet, somewhere ordinary, somewhere that doesn't usually make it into the history books but shaped more American lives than almost anything else that decade produced. We're going grocery shopping in 1950s America. Before we start, if this channel has become part of your bedtime routine, thank you. Genuinely. There is something strange and wonderful about knowing that somewhere out there, in a dark room, a phone propped against a pillow, someone is drifting off to the sound of my voice describing canned soup and margarine laws. I don't take that for granted. If you'd like, leave a comment telling me what city you're in and what time it is where you are. I like picturing the map of everyone listening at once. Now get comfortable. Turn down the lights if you haven't already. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw unclench. There is nowhere you need to be and nothing you need to do except listen. Tonight we're going to walk slowly through a version of America that no longer exists, aisle by aisle, dollar by dollar, decision by decision. Let it carry you somewhere soft. Let's begin with a question. What did it actually feel like to buy groceries in the middle of the 20th century? Not the version on the greeting cards, the woman in pearls holding a can of soup with an expression of serene, vacant happiness. The real version. The version with a budget that had to be defended, a husband who might notice if the roast was smaller than last week's, 4 children who needed feeding on a single income, and a store the size of an airplane hangar designed, quietly and deliberately, to relieve you of as much money as possible before you reached the milk. Was it exhausting? Was it, in its own strange way, satisfying? Did a woman in 1954 feel pride when she came home under budget? Or did she feel the particular tiredness of someone who has just spent 2 hours doing arithmetic in her head, while also managing a toddler who wanted candy from every single shelf at toddler height, which is not a coincidence, by the way. We'll get to that. Tonight you are going to live an ordinary Tuesday in an ordinary American kitchen in an ordinary year in the middle of the century. Let's start where it always started, not at the store. At the kitchen table the night before, with a pencil that's been sharpened one too many times, and a notepad that already has a phone number, and a half-finished recipe scrawled somewhere on an earlier page. Grocery shopping in mid-century America was not a spontaneous act. Nobody wandered into a store on a whim because they had a sudden craving for something specific. It was planned the way a small military operation is planned, with a list, a budget, and a working knowledge of exactly what sat in the icebox already. That list was more than a reminder. It was a record of what the household could afford to want that week, and what it would have to quietly let go of. This work belonged almost entirely to women. Historians estimate that somewhere close to 9 in every 10 grocery trips in this period were made by housewives, and the responsibility that came with that number was heavier than the number itself suggests. Doing it well, efficiently, cheaply, and in a way that still looked generous on the table was treated less like a chore and more like a test of character. There was a method to it, and the method mattered. A well-organized woman wrote her list in the order the aisles ran: produce first, then meat, then dairy, then the long stretch of canned goods, then bread last so it wouldn't get crushed under everything else in the bag. Some women redrew their entire list format every time a store changed its layout. Others kept the same template for years, filling it in fresh each week like a form that never stopped being useful. Sitting beside the list always was the budget, watching over the whole process like a strict but familiar relative. A family of 4 in the early part of the decade might spend somewhere around $20 to $25 a week on groceries. It sounds like almost nothing today, until you remember that the same paycheck also had to cover the mortgage, the car payments, the heating bill, new shoes for growing feet, and whatever unplanned expense the week decided to throw in. Every item on that list had already been quietly evaluated before it was even written down. The name brand against the store brand. The bigger can that cost more upfront but worked out cheaper per serving. The cut of meat that was on sale this week, and the small, nagging question of whether it was on sale because it was a bargain or because something about it needed to be sold quickly. Magazines helped, or tried to. Good Housekeeping and Better Homes and Gardens ran monthly features with titles like Feed a Family of 4 for $15, complete with a suggested menu, a coordinated shopping list, and a photograph of a casserole that looked considerably better in the magazine than it would ever look on an actual dinner table. The list inside the magazine was the dream. The list on the kitchen notepad was the reality. Most households copied a little of one onto the other and arrived somewhere workable in the middle. And then there were the coupons, cut from the Sunday paper with actual scissors, sorted into an envelope or a small accordion folder that lived in a kitchen drawer, and carried to the store with the quiet confidence of someone who had done the work and earned the discount. There was no embarrassment attached to clipping coupons in this period. It wasn't a sign of struggle. It was a sign of attention. It was what a sensible person did. By the time the list was finished, reviewed once more, and set down by the car keys, it had become something closer to a contract than a reminder. A good list was a small point of pride. A sloppy one felt like a failure before the shopping trip had even begun. The list stood between the shopper and the store like a script she was expected to follow, in a building that had been specifically designed to make her forget it. But before any of that could happen, she had to actually get to the store, and in the middle of the 20th century, that in itself was its own small production. If the family had a car, and a meaningful number of families still didn't in the early part of the decade, it was usually large, heavy, gleaming with chrome, and almost entirely without what we'd now consider basic safety features. No seatbelts as standard, no power steering in a lot of models. An engine that made noises a modern mechanic would probably describe as a cry for help. The car wasn't just transportation. It was a small, rolling declaration of how the family was doing. People saved for years to buy one. They argued about which model said the right things about them. It sat in the driveway like a statement of intent, and driving it to the store in its own quiet way was a kind of performance of the life a family was building. But the car needed somewhere to go, and the new suburbs needed the car to get there. This was the loop the decade built for itself almost without noticing. As developers laid out new housing tracts beyond the old city limits, streets curving gently, young trees barely thicker than a wrist planted at careful intervals, the stores followed them out. Not the small corner grocers that had served the older neighborhoods on foot for generations, but new supermarkets, built for volume, built for parking, planted at busy intersections surrounded by acres of asphalt. To reach your groceries now, you drove. There wasn't really another option. For the households without a car, arrangements had to be made. You shopped at whatever smaller, pricier grocer was within walking distance. You caught a ride with a neighbor who happened to be going anyway. You sent an older child ahead with a list and an exact, carefully counted amount of change, and strict instructions not to lose either one. Shopping day itself usually came once a week, often a Thursday or a Friday morning, timed so the weekend's bigger meals could be planned around whatever came home in the bags. You dressed for it, not formally. This wasn't church, but presentably. Curlers were fine preparation at home, but not acceptable in public. A house dress, a cardigan, sensible shoes, hair already set the night before. Nobody went to the grocery store looking like they hadn't tried at all, because the grocery store, as we're about to see, was very much a place where people saw each other. Children sometimes came along, which was its own calculated risk. Left largely to their own instincts, a child in a 1950s grocery store behaved roughly the way a child in a grocery store behaves today. Unpredictable, loud in bursts, magnetically drawn to the candy display, and possessed of an uncanny ability to touch every single item within reach of the lower shelves. Managing them was simply part of the trip, along with quiet negotiations and firm-sounding threats that both parties understood on some level would not be fully carried out. And then finally the parking lot. Vast, pale, gleaming faintly under the afternoon sun, a little disorienting in how open it was compared to the tight, familiar streets of an older neighborhood grocer. The cart waited by the entrance. The list sat folded in a handbag, and the week, one aisle at a time, was about to be stocked. Walking through the doors of a mid-century American supermarket for the first time was, by nearly every account that survives from the period, something close to a religious experience. Not because the food itself was extraordinary. We'll get to the food, and much of it was ordinary at best, but because of the sheer, almost overwhelming scale of the place. These stores were new enough that they still carried a faint electric charge of novelty, a sense that you had stepped, quite literally, into the future, and that the future had fluorescent lighting and very shiny floors. The lights buzzed overhead, harsh and even, banishing every shadow a corner grocer's dim little shop might have kept. The floors were polished linoleum, reflecting the lights back up at you so that the whole store seemed to glow faintly from beneath your feet. The shelves rose tall on either side. The aisles stretched wide enough for two carts to pass without either woman having to pull hers in, and there was just so much of everything. Rows of identical cans marching off into the distance. Cereal boxes stacked into small, cheerful towers. Produce arranged into pyramids so careful they looked almost sculptural. Somewhere always, a radio or a speaker system played something pleasant and forgettable, music chosen specifically, because it slowed your walking pace without you noticing, which, not coincidentally, tended to loosen your wallet a little as well. The cart itself deserves a moment of its own, because the cart very nearly didn't happen. A grocer out in Oklahoma by the name of Sylvan Goldman had invented the folding shopping cart back in the late 1930s, more than a decade before our story tonight, and it had not been an instant success. Shoppers, oddly enough, resisted it. Something about pushing a large wire basket around in public apparently struck early customers as undignified, faintly ridiculous, not something a respectable person did. Goldman, the story goes, actually had to hire people to walk around his store pushing empty carts, just to make the sight of it look normal before real customers would agree to try one themselves. By the time our decade rolls around, the resistance has long since faded. The cart has been refined, made bigger and sturdier, and fitted with a small fold-down seat at the front, solving the age-old problem of where exactly to put a toddler while you shopped, and creating in the same stroke an entirely new problem. A toddler now sitting at the perfect height to grab absolutely everything within arm's reach. The whole philosophy of these new stores rested on an idea the era called one-stop shopping, and it really was new. Before the supermarket's rise, feeding a household for a week meant multiple separate stops, each with its own hours and its own quiet social rules. The butcher for meat, the bakery for bread, a greengrocer for produce, a dairy, sometimes literally a man with a horse-drawn or motorized delivery route, for milk, a delicatessen for cold cuts if you were lucky enough to have a good one nearby. Each stop was its own small transaction, its own relationship, its own walk down its own street. The supermarket folded all of it into a single building, a single trip, standardized prices printed right there on the shelf tag instead of negotiated across a counter. For anyone who'd grown up with the old system, handing a list to a man behind a counter and having him fetch things for you from shelves you couldn't reach or weren't invited to browse, the supermarket must have felt like being handed the keys to something enormous. You could wander. You could compare two nearly identical cans side by side and decide for yourself which one earned a place in your cart. You could pick up something you'd never tried before, read the label slowly and thoroughly, and simply put it back if it didn't convince you, and nobody behind a counter would raise an eyebrow at you for it. That freedom was real, and people felt it. What most shoppers didn't fully register, at least not yet, was how deliberately that freedom had been engineered. Store designers had learned, mostly through quiet observation of where customers actually walked and what they actually bought once they got there, that the physical layout of a store was itself a kind of persuasion. Produce, bright and colorful, was placed near the entrance because it created an instant impression of abundance and freshness that colored a shopper's mood for the rest of the trip. The absolute staples, the things you were certain to need no matter what, tended to sit at the very back of the store, while the smaller, more tempting items were arranged at eye level along the route you had to walk to reach them. The whole environment had been calibrated, carefully and repeatedly, to walk a shopper past as much of the store's inventory as possible before she ever reached the handful of items she'd actually come in for. You arrived with a list. You left with the list, mostly fulfilled, and also a few things that had never been written down at all. The store had been built with precisely that outcome in mind, and week after week it worked. Now let's talk about the man behind the meat counter, because in this decade, the butcher was not simply an employee slicing product. He was something closer to a neighborhood fixture, a minor but genuine social institution. At a proper butcher counter, whether inside the new supermarket or still standing on its own in an older part of town, the man behind the glass case knew you. Not vaguely, not as a face among many, but specifically. He knew your family's preferences, remembered that your mother-in-law was coming for Sunday dinner, and that you'd want something that looked impressive without actually costing what impressive things cost. He knew your children turned their noses up at anything too fatty, and that your husband liked his steak thick and didn't care for it fussed over. He had built this knowledge slowly, transaction by transaction, the way any tradesperson builds an understanding of a regular customer, through attention and memory and the simple accumulated fact of showing up, week after week, and paying attention to what people actually needed rather than only what they asked for. He would steer you gently toward the right cut for the right occasion. He would advise against something if he thought it wasn't worth the price that week. And if he liked you, if you'd been coming long enough and had earned a bit of goodwill, he might slip a little extra into the wrapped paper without changing the price. This wasn't corruption, and nobody thought of it that way. It was the informal economy of the counter, a quiet system of favor and loyalty running alongside the official price list, making both the butcher and the customer feel that what had just happened was about more than a simple exchange of money for meat. Because in a real sense, it was. Meat, it's worth remembering, was proportionally far more expensive relative to a typical household budget than it tends to be today, and choosing the right cut each week involved a careful negotiation between what a recipe called for, what the budget allowed, and what was actually sitting in the case that day. Ground beef did most of the heavy lifting. Cheap, versatile, endlessly forgiving of an inexperienced cook's mistakes, capable of becoming meatloaf one night, hamburger patties the next, and a casserole bound together with a can of cream of mushroom soup the night after that. Chicken sat even lower on the price scale, though in the earlier part of the decade it still carried a faint whiff of austerity, something you served when you couldn't quite manage beef. Beef itself, particularly a proper roast, was aspirational. A standing rib roast on a Sunday table was practically an announcement that things were going well for the family that year. Pork held a strange middle ground. Bacon was beloved by everyone and questioned by no one. Pork chops made for a dependable weeknight meal. Ham felt festive, a little more expensive, reserved for occasions that mattered. And the various lesser cuts filled in the gaps of a tight week's menu with a plain, unglamorous usefulness that never earned much praise but always got the job done. Lamb existed on the shelves, but was regarded by much of the country as something of an acquired taste. Veal turned up more often in ambitious cookbooks than in actual shopping carts. Whatever you chose, the butcher wrapped it the same way, in crisp white paper, folded with a practiced, almost ceremonial efficiency, sealed shut with a strip of tape. The contents, weight, and price scrawled on the outside in grease pencil, in handwriting that ranged from perfectly neat to nearly illegible depending entirely on which butcher had served you that day. You tucked the package under one arm or set it carefully into the cart, and moved on with the small, specific satisfaction of having handled the most expensive item on your list and come away with something genuinely good. Through the course of the decade, the freestanding neighborhood butcher shop was slowly, steadily being replaced by the supermarket's own butcher counter, and something subtle was lost in that shift, even if nobody could quite name it at the time. The supermarket's butcher was an employee, not the proprietor of his own small business. He had less personal stake in whether you left satisfied, less freedom to bend the official price for a loyal customer, less authority to make the small, unofficial gestures that had made the old neighborhood butcher feel less like a vendor and more like a resource you could actually rely on. The counter looked the same. The white paper was the same. But the relationship underneath it all had already begun quietly thinning, in a way that would keep thinning for decades to come. Now let's step over to produce, because here is something that takes a genuine mental adjustment if you're used to a modern grocery store. In the middle of the 20th century, produce in America was seasonal. Genuinely, completely, non-negotiably seasonal. There were no strawberries in the dead of winter, no mangoes appearing on a shelf in Minneapolis in February. No bags of pre-washed salad greens sitting under a fine mist in a refrigerated case. What was available on any given week was whatever grew locally, or whatever could survive the truck journey up from somewhere warmer. And survive, in this context, is doing a fair amount of quiet work as a word. Tomatoes often arrived a little bruised and apologetic. Lettuce meant iceberg almost exclusively, because iceberg, more than any other variety, could take the abuse of a long truck ride and still look presentable on a shelf. Bananas were the reliable exception, a tropical fruit available essentially year-round, thanks to decades of aggressive shipping infrastructure built up by companies with enormous banana interests in Central America. Apples were everywhere come autumn and conspicuously scarce by midsummer. Corn belonged entirely to summer, sweet and short-seasoned, one of the genuine small joys of the July produce section. Peaches and plums came and went within a matter of a few short weeks, and a smart shopper bought them in quantity while they were there, because next week they might simply be gone. The produce section of a typical store in this period was modest by any modern comparison. A relatively small area, usually near the entrance, offering maybe a dozen kinds of vegetables and perhaps 15 varieties of fruit at the very peak of the growing season, tapering down to considerably less once winter set in. And yet this small section was treated with a kind of reverence the rest of the store didn't quite earn, because fresh produce was understood to be perishable, a little bit precious, and something of a quiet marker of a well-run household. You were expected to touch things, and this wasn't considered rude in the slightest. It was simply how you shopped. You picked up a tomato, felt for a little give beneath your thumb, checked its color, and if you were serious about it, brought it close enough to smell. You squeezed peaches gently. You peeled back a corner of a corn husk to inspect the silk underneath before committing. You lifted a melon, knocked on it with your knuckles, and listened for that particular dull, heavy thud that told you it was ripe, as opposed to the hollow, higher-pitched thunk that told you you'd be disappointed on Saturday. The produce clerk, because there usually was one station nearby, watched all of this with the calm, practiced patience of a man who had spent 30 years observing people knock on melons and still couldn't entirely explain, even to himself, why it worked. Winter brought its own particular version of reality to this section of the store. By January in most parts of the country, the produce area contracted noticeably. Root vegetables took over: potatoes, carrots, turnips, onions, parsnips. Cabbage, which kept well in storage, appeared constantly. Canned vegetables stepped in to fill whatever gap remained, which goes a long way toward explaining why canned peas and canned green beans were so thoroughly woven into the era's home cooking. They weren't really a preference so much as a practical solution to a seasonal problem that returned, reliably, every single year. Frozen vegetables were beginning to offer some relief by the middle of the decade. Bird's Eye had been selling frozen peas and corn since the 1930s, but fresh still won out whenever it was actually available. A housewife who reached for frozen when fresh was sitting right there on the shelf was making a small, quiet statement about her priorities, and the culture of the time had opinions about that statement, whether she wanted them or not. In a store built almost entirely around standardization, where one can of peas was identical to the next, and required no thought at all, the produce section stood out as the one place that refused to cooperate. Every apple was slightly different from its neighbor. Every head of lettuce carried its own particular weight and moisture. You had to actually look, actually evaluate, actually decide. And the section rewarded shoppers who knew what they were looking at while showing no mercy whatsoever to anyone who bought a melon without bothering to knock on it first. If the mid-century American supermarket had anything you could call a beating heart, it lived in the canned goods aisle. Row after seemingly endless row of gleaming tin cylinders, stacked with an almost military precision, each one labeled in bright, cheerful lettering, decorated with a painting of whatever vegetable lived inside. A painting that always, without fail, looked considerably more vivid than the actual contents ever would. Canned food in this decade was not viewed as a compromise. Quite the opposite. It was treated as a genuine triumph, a small piece of modernity you could hold in one hand. It meant a family no longer had to spend a hot summer week putting up their own vegetables. That exhausting and faintly dangerous ritual of boiling jars, sealing lids, and then spending the whole winter quietly hopping nothing on the root cellar shelf had fermented wrong or turned into something you didn't want to think too hard about. The can had done all of that labor for you already, industrially, consistently, and safely, and the housewives of the era treated it with exactly the respect that achievement deserved. Campbell's alone offered something in the neighborhood of 20 different soup varieties and treated every single one of them as culturally interchangeable. Tomato, chicken noodle, cream of mushroom, clam chowder, beef with vegetables, vegetarian vegetable. Each one sat in its familiar red and white can. Each one cost somewhere around a dime, and each one could become an entire lunch in the time it took to open the can, stir in an equal amount of water or milk, and warm it over a medium flame. But Campbell's had discovered something even more valuable than soup on its own. The cream of mushroom variety in particular had quietly become infrastructure. It wasn't just soup, it was the binder, the base, the shortcut sitting at the very center of an enormous share of the era's casserole recipes, and every home cook in the country seemed to understand this instinctively. The casserole itself was one of the decade's genuine culinary inventions, a complete meal built from whatever happened to be sitting in the pantry, assembled in a rectangular dish, baked, and set on the table with a confidence that the presentation itself did a lot of the convincing. Green bean casserole, green beans, cream of mushroom soup, crispy fried onions on top. Tuna noodle casserole, egg noodles, canned tuna, the same reliable soup, a handful of frozen peas, a layer of breadcrumbs browned on top. What made these dishes so beloved was how little they demanded of the cook while still delivering, in a single dish that doubled as its own serving vessel, a protein, a vegetable, a starch, and a sauce all at once. Fewer pots, fewer pans, less to clean afterward. Dinner ready by 7. Done. Beyond Campbell's own shelf space, the aisle stretched on with Del Monte's canned fruits and vegetables, Libby's pumpkin and corned beef hash, Hunt's tomatoes in their many forms, Spam occupying its own strange category somewhere between canned meat and aggressive optimism, baked beans prepared several different ways, tuna packed in oil, which was the standard long before water-packed tuna became widely available, and mandarin oranges suspended in a light syrup, which turned up in salads with a frequency that still, honestly, defies easy explanation. There was even a small hierarchy within the canned soup world itself. Condensed soups needed a can of liquid added before they were ready. Ready-to-serve soups didn't need anything at all. Condensed was cheaper and took up less shelf space in the pantry. Ready-to-serve cost a little more and carried a faint air of mild luxury. Which one you bought came down to your budget that week, and to how much you trusted yourself not to forget the water, which turned out to be a more common mistake than the Campbell's company would probably have liked to admit. The canned goods aisle was also where a carefully written list tended to quietly expand. You'd come in for cream of mushroom and a can of tomato paste, and somehow leave with a can of something called chop suey vegetables that had simply looked interesting, plus a can of fruit cocktail because it happened to be on sale that week. The aisle invited browsing in a way the produce section never did, because produce demanded evaluation, judgment, real attention, while canned goods were reassuringly, reliably identical to whatever you'd bought the week before. No decisions required beyond whether or not you wanted it. It simply went into the cart. If canned goods were the beating heart of the store, then frozen foods were its nervous system, still very much developing, occasionally a little unpredictable but humming with real potential. The frozen section occupied a comparatively small but disproportionately exciting stretch of real estate, lined with long white chest freezers or upright glass-fronted cases that breathed cold air out into the aisle and glowed faintly beneath the overhead fluorescent lights in a way that felt, to a lot of shoppers, genuinely futuristic. Frozen vegetables had arrived first, and by this point in the decade they'd become accepted, even if they hadn't quite been fully celebrated yet. Frozen peas were, if anyone was being honest about it, actually better than their canned counterparts, a fact that even devoted canned goods loyalists would quietly admit under the right circumstances. Frozen corn on the cob offered a reasonably convincing taste of summer in the middle of February. Frozen orange juice concentrate, which had been introduced commercially only a few years earlier, had already become something close to a breakfast institution. You kept a can of it in the freezer, mixed it with a few cans of water, stirred and poured, and suddenly breakfast had juice in it without anyone having to peel a single orange. This felt, at the time, like exactly what progress was supposed to look like. And then came the frozen dinner. Introduced by a major poultry company in 1953, reportedly as a clever solution to an enormous overstock of leftover turkey from the previous Thanksgiving, the concept was elegantly simple. A complete meal, neatly divided into compartments inside a segmented aluminum tray, designed to slide directly into a hot oven for around 25 minutes, and then be eaten right out of the same tray it had cooked in. The very first version offered turkey with cornbread dressing, gravy, sweet potatoes, and peas, and sold for well under $1. The marketing name attached to this product deserves its own moment of appreciation, because it wasn't called a convenience meal or a quick entree. It was named for the television set it was clearly designed to be eaten in front of, and in doing so, the company had named not just a product but an entire cultural shift that was already quietly underway. It was an open acknowledgement that Americans were increasingly eating dinner in front of the new television sets filling their living rooms, that the formal dining room was slowly giving ground to the sofa, and that the whole shape of family dinner was loosening in ways nobody had quite settled on yet. The compartmentalized aluminum tray itself borrowed its design from the trays used on airline flights, which at the time still carried a genuine glamour, a small suggestion that eating from one of these trays made you, however briefly, a person sophisticated enough to travel by air. Sales of that very first frozen dinner reportedly reached around 10 million units within its first year alone, and competitors followed almost immediately. The frozen foods case expanded rapidly to make room, growing from a modest novelty corner into a legitimate destination of its own within the store, one deserving its own dedicated line on the weekly shopping list. The future, it turned out, was cold, a little bit institutional in appearance, and absolutely delicious on the evenings when you were simply too tired to cook anything from scratch. It's worth pausing on one particular irony here. The housewife who served her family a frozen dinner that evening generally received no credit whatsoever for the meal. The dish had, in a sense, prepared itself. The oven had done the actual work. There was nothing for anyone at the table to compliment, nothing to ask about, no visible labor to praise, because there simply wasn't much visible labor involved. She had opened a box and set a timer, and by the quiet, unspoken logic of the period, that counted as a small domestic shortfall dressed up in the language of convenience. She likely didn't experience it that way herself. She was probably, more than anything, simply relieved to have one evening where dinner required almost nothing of her at all. Now let's talk about the dairy aisle, because dairy in this decade was simple in its actual products and remarkably complicated in what it was made to represent. Milk meant whole milk, always, without exception. The very idea of a low-fat or skim variety being something a shopper might actually want was still years away, and would have struck most people in this period as roughly equivalent to selling watered-down milk on purpose. You bought whole milk. Your children drank whole milk at every single meal, and at school, and at essentially every opportunity presented to them, because milk meant calcium, and calcium meant strong bones, and strong bones were understood to be a kind of structural requirement for the next generation of Americans who would eventually grow up and carry the whole country forward. Milk wasn't optional. Milk was practically an expression of patriotism. Most households still had milk delivered directly to the front step. The milkman arrived well before dawn, glass bottles clinking gently inside his wire carrier, the empty bottles from the day before already set out the night before to be collected and refilled. The dairy case inside the supermarket existed mainly for households that had run short between deliveries, or that simply didn't have a milkman on their route at all. For a large portion of the decade, home delivery remained the preferred and parallel system, one the supermarket, for all its convenience, couldn't quite replicate. The milkman knew exactly how many bottles a household typically needed. He adjusted automatically around holidays. He left a note if a delivery had to be changed for any reason. He was, in his own quiet way, another one of those personal service relationships that the enormous new supermarket simply couldn't offer. Butter, meanwhile, was simply butter, sold in the familiar 4-stick-pound package, salted or unsalted, used with a generosity that later decades would come to view with something between nostalgia and mild alarm. Butter went into everything. Butter went on top of everything else that had already been cooked in butter. Recipes from this era call for amounts of it that a modern reader often has to read twice just to be sure it isn't a typo. It is not a typo. The home cook of this period used butter roughly the way a modern cook uses olive oil, as a baseline ingredient, a starting point around which everything else in the dish was organized. Then there was margarine, which turned out to be the genuine controversy of the entire dairy aisle, generating a surprising amount of heat for a product that, on its face, seems like it shouldn't have mattered nearly this much. It was cheaper than butter, and it was marketed aggressively as modern, as heart-friendly, as practical for the budget-conscious household. Butter interests fought back with a territorial intensity that suggests they understood exactly what was at stake in the fight. A handful of dairy-heavy states actually passed laws prohibiting the sale of yellow-colored margarine outright. You had to buy it pale white, deeply unappetizing in appearance, packaged with a small separate capsule of yellow food coloring that you were expected to knead into the mass yourself at home, until it reached something resembling butter's familiar color, and a far less convincing approximation of butter's general dignity. These laws remained on the books in some states until the early years of this very decade, and even after they were repealed, the stigma lingered for a good while longer. Serving margarine instead of butter was, in its small way, a social tell, a quiet signal about a household's budget that the household itself might have preferred not to broadcast. Serving real butter, by contrast, was a small, genuine luxury and a small, genuine statement that things were adequate. Every single week, the dairy aisle asked the shopper to make this choice all over again, based on the budget and on exactly how much she cared what the neighbors might notice. Eggs came in cardboard cartons of a dozen, checked through the small perforations in the lid or occasionally opened right there at the store to look for cracks, then carried home carefully and refrigerated right away. Cheese, for most households, meant sharp or mild cheddar, along with a processed cheese product that occupied a strange middle ground somewhere between actual cheese and a material an engineer might find professionally interesting. And then, finally, bread. Bread in mid-century America had achieved a texture that no earlier generation would have recognized as bread at all. It was soft, almost aggressively, triumphantly soft, pillowy and yielding, sliced with mechanical uniformity, wrapped in wax paper sealed with a colorful twist tie that children across the entire country learned, almost immediately, to leave lying open and unused on the kitchen counter. The dominant national brand had spent years building its reputation around building strong bodies through added nutrients, and by this decade it was simply everywhere. Not merely available but genuinely dominant, the default loaf against which every other bread on the shelf was measured, and generally found to be unnecessarily complicated by comparison. To understand that dominant white bread is to understand something quite specific about what a post-war America wanted from its food. Reliability, softness, an absence of surprises, and the comforting assurance that trained professionals in laboratories somewhere had already checked it over and approved it, and had gone ahead and added several important vitamins to it, just to be certain. The wrapper proudly listed niacin, iron, thiamine, riboflavin, printed with all the confidence of a product that had been meaningfully improved by science. This wasn't simply bread. It was optimized bread. It was bread that professionals had thought carefully about on your behalf. That famous softness wasn't an accident either. Industrial baking techniques had been refined to the point where a slice could be compressed almost to nothing under gentle pressure, and then spring right back to its original shape, producing something that was technically bread by every measurable standard, yet felt in the hand like something a particularly accommodating cloud might have made on an especially good day. A slice could be squeezed flat, rolled into a tight little cylinder, and released to slowly unfurl back into its original shape, and children across the country did exactly this on a regular basis, purely because it was one of the small, reliable pleasures the decade had to offer. The bread aisle offered a handful of other configurations as well: hamburger buns, hot dog buns, a bag of soft dinner rolls, and rye bread, which carried a faint big city delicatessen air about it, something an uncle from the right kind of neighborhood might bring home. Whole wheat existed on the shelf too, though it was generally regarded as slightly medicinal, the bread equivalent of eating something you weren't entirely sure you were supposed to be enjoying. Sourdough, artisan loaves, crusty European-style bread, none of that had really arrived yet, in part because the particular craving they would eventually satisfy hadn't been widely recognized as a craving at all yet. Many of the larger stores had begun adding their own in-house bakery section by this point in the decade, offering a limited range of fresh-baked goods, white bread, occasionally a fruit loaf or a coffee cake, a tray of dinner rolls set out on Friday afternoons ahead of the weekend. The smell of it drifted forward through the store from the back, so deliberately and effectively appealing that it barely needs further comment. The people who designed these stores understood perfectly well what the smell of fresh bread did to a tired shopper, and the bakery was never placed at the back purely because that happened to be the most convenient spot for the ovens. White sandwich bread, meanwhile, quietly carried an entire generation's school lunches inside its soft interior. It held the peanut butter and the jelly together. It held the bologna and the mustard. It held the sliced American cheese and a single leaf of lettuce. It asked almost nothing of whatever went inside it and gave very little character back in return, but it was there, reliably, every single day, in nearly every lunch pail in nearly every school across the country. The bread aisle was never glamorous. It was fundamental. And in an era so thoroughly focused on building solid, dependable fundamentals, that was exactly the point. Now, the cereal aisle. Walk into it in this decade, and you were, in every meaningful sense, walking straight into a marketing campaign aimed squarely at children, delivered through the medium of brightly colored cardboard and the brand new, enormously powerful distribution channel of television. Cereal manufacturers had made a deliberate, calculated decision sometime in the years just before our story tonight. The kind of decision that looks obvious in hindsight and genuinely revolutionary in the moment. Stop selling cereal to the adults who actually paid for it, and start selling it directly to the children who would eat it, through the children's programming that was rapidly colonizing the new television sets appearing in living room after living room across the country. One tiger-themed mascot made his debut in 1952. A mischievous cartoon rabbit followed a couple of years later. A trio of cheerful cartoon characters representing the Snap, Crackle, and Pop of Rice cereal had actually been around since the 1930s, but found their fullest expression only once they made the leap onto television screens. These weren't simply advertising drawings. They were personalities, familiar, consistent, adored by children with an intensity that made them remarkably difficult for a tired parent to argue against in the cereal aisle on a Saturday morning, especially when the box in question cost less than 50 cents. The sugar content of these cereals was extraordinary by any modern standard, and openly, proudly celebrated rather than hidden. The word sugar appeared right there in several product names, presented as a genuine selling point rather than something to downplay, because sugar in this decade still represented the future. Sugar meant sweetness, sweetness meant pleasure, and pleasure was exactly what post-war prosperity had promised to deliver to ordinary families. There simply wasn't yet a medical or cultural consensus that the sugar content of a children's breakfast cereal deserved any particular scrutiny. The cereals had names built around that sugar, and children ate them, and no committee anywhere convened to discuss it. The small prizes hidden inside the box deserve their own moment of attention too. Cereal boxes throughout this decade regularly contained little plastic toys, decoder rings, cardboard cutout figures, or miniature activity sets, either buried right there in the cereal itself or available separately by mail if you sent in the box top along with a small amount of money. This premium system amounted to a genuine masterwork of understanding what motivated a child, because it created a reason to want the cereal that had almost nothing to do with the cereal itself. The child wasn't really asking for breakfast. The child was asking for a decoder ring that happened to arrive surrounded by a modest quantity of frosted cereal. Parents bought the box because their children demanded it, and children demanded it because the television had told them to. And the television, still new enough to feel trustworthy and important, spoke with a confident authority that had been invited willingly into the home. Adult shoppers in this same aisle had their own, considerably more restrained options waiting for them. Corn Flakes, a wheat-based cereal marketed on its high fiber content, shredded wheat, and all-brand variety. All of them products that made no particular promises about excitement and delivered fully on that lack of promise. These were serious cereals, packaged in plain boxes with small, dignified lettering, and absolutely no cartoon mascot in sight, intended for serious people who understood breakfast as fuel rather than entertainment. A bowl of one of these, poured with cold whole milk, was complete, modern, fast, and for the child sitting across the table, accompanied by an entirely different box, one with a cardboard character staring back with enormous, cheerful eyes, promising that today, without question, was going to be a great one. Let's move now to the deli counter, because in this decade the deli counter was less like a modern service window and more like a small stage, and the man working behind the glass was, in every meaningful sense, performing. Sliced meats sat arranged behind that glass like small museum pieces. Bologna, salami, an olive-studded loaf, head cheese, and something called pickle and pimento loaf that defied any easy description, but seemed to have a genuinely devoted following among people whose palates had apparently survived rationing and come out the other side with some unusual priorities intact. Lunch meat, understand, was not a minor category. The American brown bag lunch, the school lunch, the desk lunch eaten at noon by a working man on his break, all of it was built on a foundation of sliced meat between two pieces of soft white bread, and the deli counter was where that entire foundation got assembled every week. This was not peripheral. This was the center of 5 lunches a week, multiplied by every single person in the household old enough to chew unsupervised. Getting the deli order right meant getting the whole week's lunches right. And getting the week's lunches right was one more piece of a much larger project of household management that left no real room for careless mistakes. Bologna carried the week. Dense, round, faintly pink, mysterious in its exact composition in a way nobody spent much time questioning. Bologna was the meat of the American school lunch so completely and so consistently that it bordered on being a kind of cultural shorthand all on its own. Children ate it, mostly without complaint, layered onto white bread with a smear of yellow mustard and a single leaf of iceberg lettuce, and considered this an entirely reasonable midday meal, because it was, and because the alternative, going home for lunch, wasn't always possible and wasn't always any better even when it was. Ham represented the upgrade. More expensive, more flavorful, carrying the faint prestige of something that had once occupied the center of a holiday table and was now being sliced thin and handed out for an ordinary Tuesday's sandwich. Salami belonged to families with a taste for something a bit more assertive, or to families of Italian heritage for whom salami wasn't an indulgence at all but simply lunch, plain and unremarkable in the best possible way. The olive-studded loaf, Bologna's stranger cousin, was for people who had developed very specific opinions about what belonged in their sandwich and weren't especially interested in being talked out of them. Being served at the counter had its own established rhythm, one that regular customers understood instinctively and newcomers had to pick up quickly. You waited your turn. You watched the person ahead of you finish their order. When the man behind the counter finally looked your way, you gave your order clearly, without excessive hesitation, because the deli counter was not a place for people who hadn't yet decided what they wanted. Half a pound of bologna, sliced thin. A quarter pound of salami, not too thin, please. He repeated the order back to confirm it and began slicing. The machine made a steady, satisfying mechanical whir that told you the order was genuinely underway, that lunch was slowly becoming real. He laid each slice carefully across the scale, watching the needle settle, adjusting with the practiced hand of someone who had done this exact motion many thousands of times before. He wrapped the finished package in white paper with brisk, efficient folds, sealed it with a strip of tape, and wrote the weight and price on the outside in grease pencil, in handwriting that was either beautifully clean or nearly impossible to read depending entirely on which man happened to be working that day. You thanked him. He nodded, already looking past you to whoever was next in line. There was something oddly dignified about the whole exchange. You were a person with a specific need. He was a person with a specific skill built to meet exactly that need. It was clean, it was honest, and it left both sides of the counter satisfied in a small but genuine way. Now, the checkout. The checkout lane in a mid-century American supermarket was, without exaggeration, a full-body athletic event, and the cashier standing behind that register was very much an athlete in her own right. There were no barcode scanners, no beeping, no glowing self-checkout kiosk standing in silent judgment of how neatly or carelessly you'd loaded your cart. Every single item had to be lifted individually, examined, and rung up one at a time on a mechanical cash register that clacked and dinged with every entry, a sound that managed to be both oddly satisfying and just slightly ominous, depending entirely on how many items were still waiting in the cart behind it. The cashier simply knew the prices. This point genuinely deserves repeating, because it is remarkable by any modern comparison. She had committed to memory the price of nearly every item carried in that store, or close enough to it that any small gaps hardly mattered. She knew a can of soup cost around a dime, that the larger size of canned peaches ran somewhere in the 30-cent range, that ground beef had gone up slightly the previous week, and exactly what it had gone up to. She carried all of this the way a skilled tradesperson carries deep familiarity with their materials, not consciously recalled but simply known, available the instant it was needed. She moved quickly, and the pace of the entire checkout line was set by her rhythm, which tended to be brisk. Items came out of the cart, passed briefly through her hands, were rung up, and slid down the counter to a bagger, often a teenage boy working his very first job, who packed the paper bags according to his own carefully learned logic. Heavy items went at the bottom. Anything fragile went on top. Bread never went underneath anything else. Eggs were always handled last and placed with particular care. The bags themselves were always paper, large and brown, with squared-off bottoms designed to let them stand upright on their own in the trunk of a car. They could hold a genuinely impressive amount of weight before finally giving out, though they had their limits, and a bag could be defeated either by a bit of unexpected moisture or by an overly confident bagger who decided a 14-pound load was structurally reasonable. When a bag did fail, it failed completely and without warning, the bottom simply giving way, usually right in the middle of the parking lot, usually with both of your hands already full of something else, and usually, for some reason, right on top of the eggs. The final total only appeared at the very end of the transaction, displayed on the register's mechanical counter in large numbers that clicked audibly into place one after another as the sum was tallied. There was always a brief pause, right between the last item being rung up and the total finally appearing, during which a shopper performed her own rapid mental arithmetic and either felt a small wave of relief or a specific, sinking recalculation of exactly what she'd bought versus what she could actually afford to spend that week. Payment was almost always in cash, the only option at most stores for the majority of the decade, or occasionally by check if the store had come to know and trust a particular customer's account well enough. Credit cards existed in a limited early form by the second half of the decade, but hadn't yet found their way into the ordinary grocery checkout. You handed over the bills, the cashier counted out your change from the register drawer with the practiced speed of someone who never had to consciously think about the arithmetic, and the transaction was finished. No receipt emailed anywhere. No digital record quietly filed away somewhere. No loyalty points silently accumulating in an account you'd forgotten you even had. Simply the change now sitting in your hand, the bags waiting on the counter, and the quiet private arithmetic of what remained in your wallet against what remained of the week. The cashier was already looking toward the next customer in line. You gathered up your bags and moved on, because the line behind you was real, and the parking lot was waiting, and dinner still needed to happen tonight regardless. Let's talk about prices for a moment, because the numbers from this decade have a way of making you feel something, whether you expect it or not. Ground beef ran around 50 cents a pound. A loaf of white sandwich bread cost somewhere close to 18 cents. A dozen eggs came to about 60 cents. A pound of coffee sat somewhere between 80 cents and a full dollar. A gallon of milk cost roughly 90 cents. A can of soup, that familiar dime. A pound of butter, around 70 cents. Pork chops, about 60 cents a pound. A whole chicken usually came in under $1, and sometimes considerably under it. These figures look almost comically small at first glance, until you set them against what people were actually earning, and then they turn into something else entirely. Sobering, recognizable, uncomfortably close to relevant. The median household income across the country in the early part of this decade sat somewhere around $4,000 a year. That figure came before taxes, before the mortgage payment, before the car note, before insurance and utilities and children's shoes, and the dentist, and whatever unplanned expense the month inevitably decided to introduce. A family of 4 spending roughly $20 a week on groceries was putting somewhere close to a quarter of its entire income directly into food, a proportion that feels enormous by modern standards, and was, at the time, simply the ordinary reality of running a household. The woman managing that weekly grocery budget was doing math constantly. Not occasionally, not only when it seemed necessary, but continuously. Walking the aisles, she carried a running tally in her head, tracking her cart's approximate total against whatever amount she'd allotted for the week. She knew prices without needing to check a single tag, because she'd bought these same items often enough that the numbers had simply become part of her working knowledge of the world. The same way she knew her neighbors' names or the exact schedule of the school bus. The choice between a name brand and a store brand was a live question every single week. Store brands, already appearing in a growing number of supermarket chains by the middle of the decade, typically came in plainer packaging labeled simply with the store's own name and cost meaningfully less. Whether the quality genuinely matched the name brand was a matter of real, ongoing household debate. Some women bought the store brand canned vegetables without a second thought. Others felt that serving a store brand soup at the family table was a kind of statement they weren't quite ready to make, whatever the savings. Clipping coupons, as we touched on earlier, was never treated as a hobby. It was a rational, entirely sensible response to the actual economics of feeding a family on a fixed income. The Sunday paper arrived thick with inserts from grocery chains and food manufacturers, and those inserts were read carefully, cut apart with real scissors, and sorted by category or by store into an envelope or small accordion folder that lived permanently in a kitchen drawer set aside for exactly this purpose. At the register, they were handed over without the faintest trace of embarrassment, because there was no cultural script yet in place that treated coupon use as anything other than plain good sense. The woman who managed her weekly budget well, who found the sale items, who used every coupon in her folder, who still came home with everything on her list and still managed to put a complete dinner on the table every single night, was performing a sustained, genuine act of financial management, one the culture around her consistently declined to describe using that word. She was called a good homemaker. She was called thrifty. She was very rarely, if ever, called a financial manager, though that is precisely, exactly, what she was, operating without a spreadsheet, without an app, and largely without anyone around her acknowledging that the skills she exercised week after week even had a proper name. Somewhere between an early loyalty program and a mild, collective national obsession, lived the great trading stamp phenomenon of the era. And if you didn't live through it yourself, you're genuinely missing something that no modern rewards point system has ever quite managed to replicate. Not because the actual rewards were particularly generous, but because the physical, hands-on, faintly compulsive act of collecting them became its own peculiar form of domestic entertainment. Here's roughly how it worked. Every purchase made at a participating grocery store earned a small paper stamp for every 10 cents spent, and as the decade wore on, more and more stores signed on, until it eventually became unusual to shop somewhere that didn't participate at all. The most famous of these programs issued stamps in a very particular, immediately recognizable shade of green, a color that became almost as well known nationally as any single brand's own logo. You brought the stamps home. You licked them, one at a time, and pressed them carefully into small paper booklets made specifically for this purpose, lining them up in neat rows across each page with the methodical patience of someone who understood that every single stamp represented a small, fractional step toward something real. The licking itself, in hindsight, was a considerable undertaking. Each stamp was tiny, the adhesive never especially generous, and a full booklet required a genuinely large number of them, which meant the entire process of filling even one book amounted to a slow, mildly unpleasant, and deeply satisfying accumulation of small, repeated effort. Some households kept a damp sponge on hand for the job. Others simply licked away. Some assigned the whole task to their children, which was either a reasonably fair division of household labor or a small, mild form of torment, depending entirely on your perspective and how many empty booklets happened to be waiting that week. Once you had accumulated enough completed booklets, and the number required varied depending on what you actually wanted, since rewards came in different tiers of booklet value, you carried them to a dedicated redemption center. This was a store that existed for one purpose only, exchanging filled booklets for merchandise, stocked with items pulled straight from the stamp company's own catalog, a catalog mailed to households across the country and treated with something approaching the same reverence usually reserved for the big seasonal mail-order catalog. A toaster, a full set of dishes, a lamp, an electric mixer, a bicycle for one of the kids, a set of luggage for a vacation nobody had actually planned yet. These items were real, tangible, visible right there in a photograph, waiting patiently at the redemption center for whoever eventually walked in with enough completed booklets, once filled, tended to live in kitchen drawers, kitchen cabinets, and at least one dedicated drawer that had long since stopped being a general junk drawer and become, permanently, a stamp overflow area. The catalog itself got consulted regularly. Progress got tracked, sometimes literally, with a pencil mark or a running tally. A waffle iron that required 47 booklets was, at any given moment, precisely 47 booklets away, and every single grocery receipt moved a household fractionally closer to owning it. Competing programs ran in different regions under different names, and the grocery chain offering the most generous stamps could attract loyal customers on that reputation alone, because the stamps managed to transform an ordinary grocery purchase into something that felt, at least emotionally, much closer to an investment. That can of soup wasn't simply dinner anymore. It was 3 stamps. And 3 stamps were one small step closer to the electric can opener sitting patiently in the catalog. None of this was especially rational when you actually worked out the math. The stamps were typically worth somewhere around 1% of the original purchase price in eventual redemption value, which is not, by any measure, a spectacular return on investment. But the psychology of physical accumulation, of licking and pressing and watching a stack of booklets slowly grow in a kitchen drawer, made the whole thing feel far more immediate and far more personally earned than any abstract percentage ever could. The supermarket had found a clever, effective way to make ordinary shopping feel a little bit like saving, and in a decade that prized both the appearance and the genuine reality of thrift, that turned out to be an extraordinarily effective thing to have discovered. Let's talk now about how these stores were actually designed, because the floor plan of a mid-century supermarket was never built by someone trying to make your shopping trip easier. It was built by someone trying to walk you past as many products as humanly possible before you finally reached the handful of things you actually came in for. And the people responsible for these layouts understood that distinction perfectly well, even if most shoppers moving through the aisles never fully grasped it themselves. Milk and eggs, the items that reliably brought the largest number of customers through the front door on any given week, were almost always positioned as far back in the store as physically possible. Past the cereal aisle, past the wall of canned goods, past the bread, past the condiments, along the entire diagonal length of the building. To reach the 2 or 3 things you absolutely needed, you had to walk directly past everything you might, with the right amount of gentle persuasion, be talked into needing as well. Nobody stood there telling you to pick up a can of fruit cocktail. It simply sat at eye level, brightly labeled, right beside the rest of the canned fruit, and you picked it up and set it in your cart because it was there, because it cost only a couple of coins, and because the picture on the label looked genuinely appealing. The end caps, those special display sections positioned at the head of each aisle, showcased specially promoted items, frequently things on sale, arranged deliberately to be visible from the main walkway running through the center of the store. These weren't necessarily items that needed to be displayed there. They were items that benefited enormously from being displayed there, products whose sales climbed measurably higher whenever they were placed somewhere visible rather than buried somewhere in the middle of their regular aisle. That end cap position amounted to prime commercial real estate, and stores charged manufacturers accordingly for the privilege, though this particular arrangement was rarely something either side advertised openly. Products aimed at children were consistently stocked at exactly child height, and this was never a coincidence requiring much explanation. A box of frosted, sugary cereal sitting at adult eye level is simply a box of cereal. The very same box positioned at the eye level of a 6-year-old becomes a conversation that will inevitably happen in the car on the way home, and quite possibly right there in the aisle itself, and will very often end with that box landing in the cart regardless of what was actually written on the list. Store designers understood this completely. Cereal manufacturers understood it just as well. The 6-year-old was simply operating exactly according to the system that had been quietly built around them from the very start. Small, inexpensive impulse items clustered thickly near the checkout lanes. Gum, mints, a candy bar, a magazine with a recipe printed conveniently right on the cover, a small toy set aside for the child who'd behaved well throughout the entire trip, or alternatively for the child who hadn't behaved quite so well and needed to be quickly managed into compliance before causing any further scene in front of the cashier. The checkout lane represented the very last opportunity the store had to add anything further to your total before you walked out the door, and it was organized with exactly that final opportunity in mind. None of this amounted to a hidden secret, in the sense of being deliberately concealed from anyone, but it wasn't yet widely discussed in the terms that later consumer advocates and behavioral researchers would eventually use to describe it. Shoppers moving through these aisles in this period weren't consciously thinking about choice architecture or environmental persuasion. They were thinking about dinner. The store, meanwhile, was quietly thinking about both at once. The list tucked inside your handbag was your one real defense against the store's careful design. A woman carrying a firm list and a firm budget proved considerably harder to divert than a woman who'd walked in with only a general sense of what she needed and had quietly expected the store itself to help her figure the rest out along the way. The list wasn't merely an organizational tool. It functioned as a genuine negotiating position, and the store had been designed, quite deliberately, by people who understood exactly what tended to happen whenever that negotiating position turned out to be soft. It's impossible to talk honestly about grocery shopping in this decade without talking at length about the women who did nearly all of it, and about the quiet weight, not just the literal weight of the bags, though that mattered too, of everything the task represented and everything the surrounding culture built up around it. The housewife functioned as her household's purchasing agent, its nutritionist, its budget manager, and its culinary director all at once, and the weekly grocery trip was the central supply run for every one of those roles simultaneously. She was expected to know what counted as nutritious, what the family could actually afford, what the children would eat without a fuss, what her husband preferred, what would look impressive enough if company came over, and how a leftover roast could quietly become tomorrow's hash and the next night's soup without anyone at the table noticing the repetition. She was expected to manage all of this cheerfully, efficiently, and without ever letting the difficulty show. The competence itself was meant to look effortless. The labor underneath it was meant to stay invisible. The women's magazines of the period served as both training manual and quiet cheerleader for this role. Good Housekeeping, Better Homes and Gardens, Ladies' Home Journal, McCall's, each arriving monthly with features on stretching a single week's shopping trip into a full week of meals, on getting more value out of every food dollar, on turning leftovers into something that read as creative rather than merely practical, and on presenting the finished results to a family in a way that suggested abundance rather than careful management. The recipes accompanying these articles were built specifically around the realities of the era's grocery aisles in ways that become obvious the moment you actually sit down and read them closely. Many called for canned ingredients not as a shortcut, but as a completely normal component, the way a modern recipe might casually call for olive oil or a clove of garlic without a second thought. They worked around the seasonal limits of the produce section rather than fighting them. They were built around whichever cuts of meat happened to be affordable that week, not necessarily around whichever cuts tasted best in some abstract sense. The recipe, in other words, was a genuinely practical document, and the magazine was a practical guide to a practical kind of life, simply dressed up in cheerful, aspirational photography. The shopping cart itself functioned as a kind of public document too. What sat inside it said something, whether a woman intended it to or not, about her household size, its budget, its aspirations, and how well it was being managed. A cart stacked with name brands and fresh produce communicated one particular story. A cart filled mostly with store brands and a loaf of day-old bread told a different one entirely. Women understood quietly and completely that other women moving through the same aisles could see exactly what sat in their cart, could draw their own conclusions from it, could form their own private opinions. The grocery store was, in every real sense, a social space, and social spaces come with an audience, and the audience filling suburban supermarkets in this decade was paying close, quiet attention. The physical labor involved in all of this was real, and it went almost entirely unacknowledged. Pushing a fully loaded cart across the length of a large store, lifting heavy paper bags into the trunk of the car, carrying those same bags from the car into the kitchen, unpacking everything, organizing it, finding a home for each item. None of it generated comment, none of it earned any particular praise because it was simply part of the day, expected, unremarkable, assumed. It wasn't the kind of labor that drew attention when it was done well. It was, instead, the kind of labor that produced, when handled correctly, only the absence of complaint, which in the domestic logic of the period stood in as the closest available equivalent to actual praise. The cart was hers. The list was hers. The budget was hers to manage day to day, even when the money itself technically came from somewhere else. A refrigerator that came home full stood as evidence of her competence. A family that was well fed stood as evidence of her success. None of it was ever formally called work. It was simply called being a good wife, and the distinction, though enormous, went almost entirely unremarked upon by nearly everyone. Now, where did men actually fit into all of this? Occasionally, mildly curiously, and often, frankly, a bit at a loss. A husband accompanying his wife to the supermarket on a Saturday morning was either a small source of mild amusement or a small source of gentle disruption, depending on his behavior, and his behavior tended, more often than not, to lean toward the disruptive side, simply because he hadn't been trained for this particular environment, and it showed. He stood in the wrong spot. He picked items off the shelf and examined them far longer than the item actually warranted, as though the label on a can of corn contained some hidden layer of meaning that required careful analysis. He offered opinions about brands that weren't especially welcome, because the brand decision in question had usually already been settled weeks or months earlier, based on price, on reliability, and on the results of the one time the family had tried the competing brand and quietly noticed the difference. He asked questions. He made suggestions nobody had asked for. He wondered aloud about things that didn't especially need wondering about. Some husbands were deliberately dispatched to a single specific aisle with a single specific sublist, a controlled deployment of a resource into a limited, manageable environment. If he was safely occupied in the coffee aisle, he couldn't simultaneously be over in the meat section, suggesting a pricier cut than the budget had allowed for. This particular strategy was rarely discussed openly as a strategy. It was framed, if it was framed at all, simply as helpfulness. But anyone who has ever sent a mildly disoriented person off to complete one bounded task inside a very large store understands exactly what was actually happening. Men who shopped entirely on their own formed a distinct category all their own. The bachelor, the widower, the husband whose wife happened to be traveling or unwell that week. These men moved through the supermarket with the specific, purposeful energy of someone who understood on some level that he was operating outside his usual area of competence, and who had decided to manage that discomfort through speed rather than careful deliberation. They didn't linger. They moved at a steady clip. They reached for the most recognizable version of every item, the biggest name, the brand the television had already told them was the safe, correct choice, and made their way to the checkout before the situation had any real chance to grow more complicated than it already was. A bachelor's cart, if you studied it closely, told its own small sociological story. Some beer, a loaf of bread, a package of bologna that would last the entire week and be eaten the exact same way every single day, standing over the kitchen sink. Perhaps a frozen dinner, because a frozen dinner asked nothing of him beyond operating an oven timer correctly. Perhaps a box of cereal, because cereal required only a bowl, a spoon, and milk. all three of which sat comfortably within reach of even fairly modest domestic ambition. The supermarket, in a very real sense, had been designed for and around one particular model of the household, the one where a woman managed the family's food supply from start to finish, and a man's role in that whole system began and ended with providing the money. The store's advertising, its physical layout, its close relationship with the women's magazines, even its hours of operation and the very design of its shopping cart, all of it assumed a primary shopper who was a woman running a household full-time. A man wandering those same aisles was, in a real sense, a visitor inside a space built around someone else entirely, navigating largely by instinct, by whatever the television had told him, and by some half-remembered impression of what his own mother used to buy. He usually made it out the other end with most of what he'd been sent for. He usually forgot something. He forgot something almost every single time. While the supermarket itself expanded outward across the new suburbs like a slow, spreading tide of parking lots in abundance, something else was quietly dying nearby. The neighborhood grocer, small, independent, frequently family-owned, often carrying a name above the door that doubled as the family's own name, was steadily losing this particular fight. That decline had actually begun back in the 1930s, when large chain stores and the newer concept of self-service shopping first began reshaping American retail from the ground up. But it was in this decade specifically that the losses became truly unmistakable, and the underlying math became genuinely irreversible. The neighborhood grocer simply couldn't compete on price, not even close. The supermarket purchased its inventory in bulk quantities that allowed it to negotiate terms no small independent operator could ever hope to access. A case of canned soup cost the supermarket considerably less than it cost the corner grocer to stock the exact same case, which meant the supermarket's shelf price came in lower as well, which meant a shopper managing a careful weekly budget, and nearly every shopper was managing a careful weekly budget, had a perfectly rational reason to drive right past the neighborhood grocer on her way to the bigger store. The math didn't require any particular sentiment to work itself out. The selection gap made things worse still. A supermarket could offer hundreds of distinct products across every single category imaginable. The neighborhood grocer, by comparison, might offer 40 feet of canned goods total, a small produce section restocked only twice a week, a meat case holding perhaps 6 or 8 different cuts, and a bread shelf carrying only 2 or 3 brands. It had always been enough before. But enough was a much harder sell in a decade that had collectively decided abundance itself was the entire point. What the neighborhood grocer still had, and what the supermarket simply couldn't replicate, and what the broader market hadn't yet learned to properly value, was the fact that he genuinely knew his customers. This mattered enormously at the time, or at least it did to the people it applied to. He knew that a particular customer's husband had been ill lately, and that she needed something easy to prepare that week. He knew the new family who just moved into the house on the corner had 4 young children and shopped accordingly. He knew exactly who was running a little behind on their account that month, and who always paid promptly, and who could use a little quiet grace at the end of the month when money ran short. He extended credit informally, without fanfare, in the manner of someone who understood that a good customer going through a rough patch was still, fundamentally, a good customer, and that the loyalty earned by extending a little grace during hard times tended to be the kind of loyalty that actually lasted. The supermarket, by contrast, extended no such credit. A sign near its checkout counters spelled out its payment policies plainly, and those policies never included the kind of informal running tab a neighborhood grocer kept quietly in a ledger behind his counter, penciled in handwriting that could always be adjusted a little if the circumstances genuinely called for it. Throughout this decade, small independent grocers closed their doors in steady, unmistakable numbers. Their old storefronts turned into dry cleaners, insurance offices, hardware stores, and eventually the kinds of businesses that didn't require choosing between them and the supermarket at all. The neighborhoods that lost their grocer lost something that didn't yet have a clean, agreed-upon name in this decade. That name came later. Later, people would call it community infrastructure, or food access, or the general social fabric of a neighborhood. At the time, most people simply called it Thursday and drove on to the supermarket, because the prices were genuinely better there, and the parking was free, and the selection was far broader, and every one of those things happened to be entirely true, even though none of them fully captured everything quietly being traded away in the process. This decade, more than any before it, deserves to be remembered as something close to the golden age of processed food, and it's worth pausing on that word for a moment, because processed carried none of the baggage back then that it tends to carry now. There was no hesitation before saying it out loud, no lowered voice, no implication that something questionable had been done to the food behind your back. Processed meant modern. Processed meant consistent, reliable, exactly the same every single time you bought it. Processed meant that trained scientists in white laboratory coats had already spent considerable time thinking about the problem more carefully than any individual home cook reasonably could, and had arrived at a product that was safe, shelf-stable, and genuinely convenient in ways fresh ingredients, with their seasonal limits and their tendency to spoil, and their stubborn refusal to ever taste quite the same twice, simply couldn't match. The post-war food industry had enormous resources behind it, enormous ambition, and an American public that had just spent years living under wartime rationing, and was more than ready to embrace abundance in essentially whatever form it happened to arrive in. Food companies understood this appetite well, and they invested heavily in research, in manufacturing capacity, in the vast distribution networks capable of moving a product from a factory somewhere on the East Coast to a supermarket shelf clear across the country, and in the advertising campaigns designed to convince a housewife thousands of miles away that this particular product genuinely deserved a permanent spot in her pantry. A smooth, orange, shelf-stable cheese spread arrived on shelves in 1952, packaged neatly in a jar, consistent in texture, ready to be spread across a cracker or a slice of bread or a raw vegetable without any of the variability that came with actual cheese. It wasn't exactly pretending to be cheese. It was something closely adjacent to cheese that had managed to solve several of cheese's more inconvenient qualities. It never molded. It never needed slicing. It was, every single time you opened the jar, exactly the same as the last time. These qualities were presented, quite openly, as genuine advantages, because in a decade that valued reliability well above complexity, they absolutely were advantages. Instant mashed potatoes, dehydrated flakes that reconstituted into something recognizably potato-like once hot water and a little butter were stirred in, had first appeared in the late 1940s, and were being enthusiastically adopted throughout this decade by housewives who saw in them one less item requiring them to stand at the stove peeling and boiling for half an hour. The end result wasn't identical to homemade mashed potatoes, and everybody involved generally knew it. The housewife knew it. The rest of the family usually knew it too. The product got purchased anyway, because the family still ended up fed, and the extra 20 minutes it saved now belonged to someone else entirely. Boxed cake mixes had actually appeared even earlier than that, but required some careful psychological engineering before they truly caught on with the broader public. The very earliest formulations required nothing but water, since everything else, including dried egg powder, had already been mixed in. But market research eventually revealed that housewives resisted these fully prepared mixes because adding only water didn't feel like cooking, didn't feel like contributing anything meaningful, didn't feel like it had earned the compliment that arrived once the finished cake was presented at the table. So manufacturers deliberately removed the dried egg from the mix, requiring the cook to crack open and add a fresh egg herself. One egg, cracked and stirred in by hand. The resulting cake was, for all practical purposes, exactly the same as before. But now the cook genuinely felt she had made it herself. Sales improved dramatically almost overnight. The food industry of this decade had more or less stumbled onto the discovery that people need to feel useful, even at the cost of a small, largely symbolic inconvenience. This wasn't purely cynical marketing calculation, or rather, it wasn't only that. Processed food in this period was solving real, genuine problems that real people actually had, even as it quietly created new dependencies and reshaped taste expectations in ways that would take decades for anyone to fully understand. Both things were simultaneously true, which tends to be how most quiet revolutions actually work. We have to spend a little time now on Jell-O, because no honest account of this era's food culture can avoid it, and no honest account of Jell-O can avoid a genuine moment of reckoning with exactly what was happening in American kitchens, and why nobody at the time seemed especially bothered by it. Jell-O itself had been around since the late 1800s, but this decade marked its absolute cultural peak, the height of its ambition, the point at which it stopped being simply a fruit-flavored gelatin dessert and became something closer to a medium of domestic self-expression, a material, almost a canvas, an entire small philosophy of entertaining guests. It was bought in enormous quantities, sold in small cardboard boxes containing a packet of flavored gelatin powder priced at around a dime, available in enough flavors to fill an entire week's rotation: strawberry, raspberry, lime, lemon, orange, cherry, black cherry, grape. It sat as one of the most dependable items in any household's pantry, right alongside the canned soup and the shortening. It was cheap. It was quick. It was, in its simple, original fruit and gelatin form, genuinely pleasant, especially refreshing in the summer heat, especially topped with a bit of whipped cream, especially if you happen to be a child with absolutely no interest in questioning the structural engineering of your dessert. But the decade did not leave Jell-O sitting quietly in the dessert course. It had far grander ambitions for it, and those ambitions produced results that genuinely deserve careful historical documentation. The Jell-O mold became the vehicle of choice, a decorative ring mold or loaf pan purchased from the housewares section of the local department store. You prepared the gelatin, poured it carefully into the mold, and then began adding things to it. Fruit, at first, which was entirely sensible and unobjectionable. Canned fruit cocktail suspended inside lime gelatin, set overnight in the refrigerator, unmolded onto a serving plate with practiced confidence. This was a perfectly legitimate dessert, attractive, refreshing, and honestly requiring more skill to present cleanly than it did to actually prepare. But then, inevitably, the vegetables entered the picture. Shredded carrots suspended in orange gelatin, sliced celery set into lemon gelatin, olives floating in lime gelatin. A combination that strongly suggests whoever invented it had experienced some kind of genuine flavor revelation they felt compelled to share with the rest of the country. Whipped cream cheese folded through. Even tuna fish, suspended in a savory aspic alongside capers and hard-boiled egg. The savory gelatin mold was entirely real, and it wasn't some fringe curiosity either. It appeared in full-color photography inside major women's magazines. It was served at dinner parties, at potlucks, at church suppers, at holiday tables across the country, and the people eating it apparently did so without any visible sign of distress. Understanding why requires understanding the broader era around it. A gelatin mold demonstrated genuine skill. Unmolding it cleanly required real technique, and a successful presentation looked visually striking in a way that suggested the cook had invested real thought and real effort into the dish. It felt modern, a manufactured product put to genuinely inventive use. It felt economical too, since it could turn inexpensive vegetables or leftover canned ingredients into something that appeared to have required considerably more effort and expense than it actually had. And in a decade that prized consistency and control above almost everything else, there was something quietly satisfying about a dish that held its shape perfectly, that could be prepared a full day ahead of time, and that arrived at the table looking exactly the way it had been intended to look, with no last-minute surprises whatsoever. The Jell-O mold was, in edible form, more or less this entire decade distilled down to a single dish, optimistic, tightly controlled, slightly strange in hindsight, and utterly convinced of its own elegance. Nobody had to invent this. The women's magazines were doing it themselves, every single month in full color, complete with suggested garnishes. Let's step over now to the pharmacy counter, because tucked into a corner of many mid-century supermarkets, past the canned goods, past the dairy case, somewhere between the household cleaning products and the greeting card rack, sat a small, slightly elevated counter staffed by a man in a white coat who wasn't a doctor, but who functioned, for a large share of the American population, as the closest thing to one they consulted on any kind of regular basis. Placing a pharmacy inside the supermarket made a certain practical kind of sense for the era. The store was already the household's one-stop destination for food. Adding a pharmacy meant it could just as easily become the one-stop destination for basic health needs too. The aspirin, the cold remedies, the vitamins, the cough syrup, the bandages, the antacids, whatever minor medical concern the week happened to bring with it. One trip, one parking lot, everything conveniently under a single roof. The logic held together cleanly. The pharmacist himself occupied a distinct, slightly elevated position within the neighborhood's social order. He carried a professional degree, wore a white coat, and stood behind a counter that was raised a few inches above the rest of the store floor, a small architectural detail that carried real meaning about the nature of the consultation taking place there. You approached him from slightly below. He looked back down at you, just slightly. None of this happened by accident. It was the spatial grammar of professional expertise, and this decade understood that grammar fluently, whether or not anyone consciously thought about it in those terms. He filled prescriptions when a prescription was genuinely called for, but he also handed out advice constantly, freely, specifically, and always with the confident authority of a man who had answered the same handful of questions 1,000 times before and had developed firm opinions about the right answers. You described your symptoms: a persistent cough, a headache that wouldn't quit, a child's ear that had been bothering her since Tuesday, and he recommended something specific. Not tentatively, not hedged with the careful liability language a modern pharmacist tends to use before ultimately telling you to go see an actual physician for anything more complicated than a scraped knee. He told you plainly what to buy, how much of it to take, and roughly when you should start feeling better. This mattered enormously to families who simply couldn't afford a full doctor's visit for every minor complaint that came up, which described most families most of the time. A doctor's visit in this decade cost real money, the kind that had to come directly out of the grocery budget if there wasn't a separate line item set aside for it, and there frequently wasn't. The pharmacist functioned as the informal triage layer sitting between the family medicine cabinet and the physician's office, and he filled that role with a directness and an easy accessibility that the more formal medical system simply couldn't match. The shelves behind him and along the nearby aisle carried the full breadth of this decade's patent medicine culture. Hair tonics for the men, cold cream and lipstick for the women, toothpaste for the children advertised by a cartoon beaver visibly concerned about proper dental hygiene, a familiar blue glass bottle of milk of magnesia, and various tonics marketed as vitamin supplements that happened to contain a genuinely surprising amount of alcohol. Vitamins in general were everywhere, and the culture was thoroughly enthusiastic about them, marketed as modern and scientific, and for children specifically, packaged in a cheerful, orange-flavored chewable form. Feminine hygiene products occupied their own particular section of the aisle, one that required a very specific, unspoken kind of navigation, found quickly, placed discreetly into the cart, often covered by something else before proceeding toward the register, paid for without extended conversation, and bagged with practiced discretion. This was simply the protocol. Nobody described it out loud or examined it closely. It simply operated, week after week, in pharmacies across the entire country, as smoothly and as silently as any other unspoken social agreement of the period. The pharmacist, quietly, knew a great deal about the households he served. He knew what a family reached for during cold season, and what a husband took for his back pain, and roughly how quickly the household went through its aspirin, which told him something, in its own small way, about that family's general stress levels. Information he simply filed away without comment. Tucked into his quiet corner of the supermarket, he was, in practice, one of the most thoroughly informed people in the entire neighborhood. And keeping nearly everything he knew to himself was, just as much as any prescription he filled, part of the job. Now let's talk about the holidays. Because nothing tested this whole carefully constructed system quite like the week leading up to Thanksgiving or Christmas. The weeks before Thanksgiving transformed the supermarket almost entirely. End caps filled up with boxes of stuffing mix and stacks of canned cranberry sauce. Pyramids of canned pumpkin rose up near the checkout lanes. A display of pie shells appeared in the bakery section that hadn't existed the week before and would quietly vanish again the week after. The store was signaling loudly, and quite commercially, that a very specific kind of cooking was about to be required of every household in the country, and that everything needed for it happened to be sitting right there, conveniently, for a limited time only. The turkey sat at the center of both the meal and the anxiety surrounding it. In the earlier part of the decade, fresh turkeys were still the standard, bought from a butcher, a farm stand, or in rural areas occasionally raised by the family itself, which introduced its own layer of emotional complication that a frozen bird neatly sidestepped. Frozen turkeys had begun arriving and were adopted enthusiastically, since a frozen turkey solved both the freshness problem and the timing problem in one stroke. You could buy it a full week ahead of time. You could tuck it into the chest freezer out in the garage and stop worrying about availability entirely. Except, of course, that a frozen turkey had to thaw properly first, and the actual thawing instructions were interpreted rather loosely by a fair share of the population. And the consequences of thawing a 20-pound bird incorrectly tended not to announce themselves until the turkey was already sitting in the oven, and the guests were already gathered in the living room. A Thanksgiving dinner built around an improperly thawed turkey, cooked at the wrong temperature for the wrong length of time, produced a very specific kind of disaster. Technically edible. In the way a great many technically edible things are technically edible, meaning you ate it anyway quietly without calling it good, and didn't bring it up again until someone else brought it up first at Christmas. The shopping trip in the week before Thanksgiving turned into something close to a contact sport. The store grew far more crowded than it ever was on an ordinary Thursday. Women who had never once made eye contact over in the produce section now found themselves standing shoulder to shoulder in front of the canned pumpkin display, wearing an expression of focused intensity, because the pumpkin supply was genuinely uncertain that week, and the pie, as everyone silently agreed, was not optional. Celery moved quickly off the shelves. Onions held steady. Butter, always butter, disappeared at an alarming rate, and the store consistently seemed to underestimate demand, leaving visible gaps on the shelf by Wednesday afternoon. A Thanksgiving without enough butter on hand was a problem no reasonable amount of margarine was ever going to solve, and everyone standing in that store understood this without a word needing to be said. Christmas brought its own particular grocery theater along with it. The quiet, serious internal debate over ham versus roast beef. The fruitcake purchased not because anyone especially wanted fruitcake, but because fruitcake had been present at Christmas for so long that its sudden absence would require some kind of explanation nobody wanted to give. Eggnog appearing in the dairy case for a strict 6-week window each year, consumed with a seasonal enthusiasm that would have been genuinely difficult to justify for any other beverage combining eggs, cream, sugar, and nutmeg in quite those exact proportions. The holidays made visible something the ordinary weekly shop usually kept comfortably hidden: just how much of the surrounding culture's sense of identity was quietly organized around food, how often the table itself functioned as the actual event rather than merely its backdrop, and how thoroughly the grocery store served as the starting point for things that mattered enormously to the people filling its aisles. Every single year, without fail, someone forgot to buy enough butter. Now, children. Because children came along constantly in this decade, particularly given that the average family had 3 or 4 of them, and the weekly grocery trip was a fixed necessity, and childcare in the modern sense wasn't something you arranged. It was simply something you were, continuously, on top of everything else you were already managing at the same time. A child inside a mid-century supermarket represented a variable, and variables have a way of complicating even the most carefully planned logistics. You arrived with your list and your budget, and every intention of moving through the aisles with brisk, efficient purpose. And you also arrived with a 4-year-old who'd spotted the cereal aisle all the way from the parking lot, and had been quietly building his case, since somewhere around the produce section, for the box with the prize hidden inside. The shopping cart helped, up to a point. That fold-down seat built into the front of the cart existed for exactly this kind of situation, a way to contain a small child without fully excluding him, strapped in facing forward, kept occupied by the passing scenery, while the actual shopping continued around him. This arrangement worked reliably right up until roughly age 3. After that, the child developed strong opinions about the scenery itself, along with the full respiratory capacity required to express those opinions at volume. The cereal aisle became the battlefield, and both sides understood exactly what they were walking into. The mother had already mapped her route through it, already had her 1 or 2 specific cereals written on the list, and fully intended to grab them and keep moving without lingering. The child, meanwhile, had been closely studying Saturday morning television advertisements aimed at exactly this aisle since sometime back in January. The child knew precisely which box contained the decoder ring. The child had preparation, motivation, and crucially, nothing but time on his hands. The negotiation that followed became one of the small, recurring dramas of mid-century domestic life, a careful weighing of parental authority against the plain reality that the box in question cost less than 50 cents. The decoder ring would buy roughly 45 minutes of blessed peace, and the walk back to the car was happening either way. Some mothers held the line every single time, purely on principle, since holding firm over a box of cereal tended to pay dividends later in larger, more consequential negotiations. Other mothers simply bought the cereal, because 50 cents was 50 cents, and the broader principle could survive losing just this once. Both strategies were entirely reasonable, and both were being deployed in the very same store. On the very same Thursday morning, one aisle apart, by women who had clearly both thought about this a great deal more than the situation on its face really warranted. The candy display position near the checkout sat there deliberately, as we've already established, placed at precisely child hand height, within effortless reach of a child who had already been patient for 40 straight minutes and now stood right at the finish line of the entire trip, directly beside a tower of nickel candies. Whoever designed that particular placement either felt genuine sympathy for the plight of a tired, waiting child, or held a complete and total indifference to the plight of the equally tired mother standing right beside him. History, unfortunately, doesn't clearly settle which explanation is correct. Children also occasionally served as small, wonderfully unreliable assistants during the shopping trip itself, sent to retrieve an item from a lower shelf, handed something to hold, sometimes even trusted to read a section of the list aloud, a system that worked reasonably well when the child in question could actually read, and considerably less well when the child chose to interpret the list with a bit of creative license. A child sent off to fetch soup would sometimes return proudly holding whichever can happen to have the most compelling artwork on its label, which wasn't always the soup that had actually been written down, and was, On at least one occasion, someone somewhere apparently still remembers a can of dog food, a discovery that raised a number of household questions nobody had been especially prepared to answer that afternoon. The very children who made these weekly trips alongside their mothers throughout this decade eventually grew up, started families of their own, and found themselves standing in the cereal aisle all over again, only now on the opposite side of the negotiation. They recognized every single tactic being used against them, largely because they had personally invented most of those tactics years earlier. They bought the cereal anyway, more often than not, because 50 cents was still 50 cents, and some lessons apparently take an entire generation to fully sink in, and others never quite sink in at all. For all its gleaming abundance, the mid-century American supermarket had gaps that a modern shopper would find genuinely startling. Walk its aisles today with a contemporary grocery list in hand, and you'd spend half your time standing in front of empty shelf space, where something you consider completely ordinary simply hasn't been invented yet, imported yet, or even imagined yet. Olive oil existed, technically, in some of the larger stores, but it lived in the specialty section, if the store even had one, tucked away as an ingredient understood mainly by families of Italian or Greek background, and used for purposes most Midwestern cookbooks of the era described only vaguely, if they described them at all. The dominant cooking fat of the decade was a solid vegetable shortening sold in a large tin, followed by butter, followed by lard, followed at some distance by the newly arriving margarine. Olive oil hadn't yet become the universal kitchen staple it would eventually turn into. It remained a regional ingredient, an immigrant ingredient, not yet fully absorbed into the mainstream American pantry. Garlic occupied a similarly uneasy position. Cookbooks of the period sometimes called for a hint of garlic, or a small amount of garlic powder if desired, and that qualifier, if desired, was doing a great deal of quiet work, acknowledging that a meaningful share of readers might consider garlic a step too far in either direction. Fresh garlic carried associations with immigrant kitchens, with Southern European cooking, with flavors that some corners of mainstream American food culture regarded with real suspicion. Garlic powder became the compromise, a version of garlic that had been processed into something more broadly acceptable, tamed by the same industrial logic that had tamed nearly everything else on the shelf. Yogurt was barely present at all. It existed in a limited way in health food stores in a handful of larger cities, purchased by people the wider culture described, often with a faint note of mild eccentricity, as health enthusiasts. The mainstream supermarket simply didn't carry it, and wouldn't for a good while longer, and even once it finally arrived, it would take considerable additional time before yogurt made its full journey from curious health food to an item bought in bulk packs without a second thought. Avocados amounted to little more than a regional curiosity, available in California and in a scattering of specialty markets in a few other large cities, but essentially absent from the rest of the country's diet entirely. If you tried to describe to a housewife in this decade the eventual place avocado would come to occupy in American eating, sliced onto toast, blended into a smoothie, mashed into a dip served at every gathering, she would likely have had several questions, starting with what an avocado actually was. The spice rack, meanwhile, was honest about the narrow range of its own ambitions. Salt, black pepper, paprika, garlic powder, onion powder, celery salt, dried parsley, dried oregano. That last one increasingly common as Italian-American cooking gradually spread beyond its original communities into the wider culture. Cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves for baking. Chili powder in the Southwest. Beyond this modest list, the shelf thinned out quickly. The extraordinary range of spices from around the world that fill a modern supermarket shelf simply didn't exist there yet, not because the rest of the world lacked them, but because the American supermarket of this period hadn't yet decided the rest of the world was especially relevant to what belonged on a home-cooked spice rack. What the store offered was entirely complete for the kind of cooking it assumed you were doing. The real limitation was how narrow that underlying assumption turned out to be, and how confidently it was held. Beyond its role as a place of pure commerce, the supermarket functioned, in a meaningful and often underappreciated way, as something close to a town square for the new post-war suburb, the one place where an entire neighborhood made itself visible in a completely unplanned, low-stakes, and genuinely democratic fashion. You went in for groceries and you saw people. Not the people you deliberately arranged to see, not people you dressed up for or prepared a conversation with in advance, but simply whoever else happened to need groceries that same Thursday morning. Your neighbor from a few streets over, whose name you knew perfectly well even though you knew almost nothing else about her actual life, standing in front of the iceberg lettuce with far more focused concentration than iceberg lettuce has ever genuinely deserved. Your child's teacher, looking slightly disorienting out of context in ordinary clothes, holding a box of cereal that revealed something small and faintly surprising about her life outside the classroom. A woman from church whose face you could have drawn from memory after 3 years of sitting 6 pews apart every Sunday, and whose name you still, somehow, weren't entirely sure of. This was never the moment to finally find out. The supermarket served as the place where a neighborhood's social life could simply show itself without needing a specific occasion to justify it. You didn't need a reason to be there. You didn't need to plan a visit or extend a formal invitation. You were there because everyone was there, because groceries were a universal weekly requirement, and the supermarket had gathered that requirement conveniently under one single roof, creating, almost by accident, a space where unplanned community happened regularly and reliably, week after week. The encounter over in the cereal aisle developed its own particular social shape, unhurried enough to allow for an actual conversation, purposeful enough that it could end naturally without any real awkwardness, bounded comfortably by the shared understanding that both of you were there to accomplish something and would eventually need to get back to doing it. You could spend a full 20 minutes catching up with someone you hadn't seen since summer and walk away from it feeling genuinely reconnected, and neither of you had to commit to a dinner invitation that neither of you was fully sure you actually wanted to follow through on. The cereal aisle conversation, in its own small way, was close to perfect. Store employees were woven into this social fabric far more thoroughly than most supermarket employees are today. A cashier who had checked you out at the same register nearly every Thursday for 2 straight years knew roughly what your household's budget looked like, and roughly how many children you were feeding, simply from watching what landed on her counter week after week. The produce clerk generally had a fair sense of who was cooking for company that particular weekend, based purely on the quality of vegetables being selected. The butcher, as we've already seen, tended to have opinions about your roasting choices, and rarely felt any particular obligation to keep those opinions to himself. These relationships were modest, entirely commercial in origin, and yet completely real. They were the texture of an actual neighborhood, built up gradually across hundreds of small transactions. The store also, depending heavily on the neighborhood in question, made certain social realities plainly visible, realities the cheerful advertisements of the period never once acknowledged. Who was welcome, who wasn't, which aisles felt comfortable and which felt quietly watched. These experiences differed enormously by race, by class, by neighborhood, in ways the smiling advertisements of the decade simply never addressed. The supermarket, in this sense, was a mirror held up to the wider social life of the suburb, reflecting back both its genuine warmth and its very real limitations. Advertisements from this period consistently painted a picture of American life that was uniformly cheerful, uniformly prosperous, and quite deliberately uniformly white. Smiling women in spotless aprons, gleaming kitchen floors, children receiving their frozen dinners with an expression of pure, uncomplicated delight. These advertisements were aspirational documents, and the specific aspiration they depicted belonged to one particular version of America, a version that was very clear, even if never stated outright, about exactly who was invited to live inside it. The actual grocery landscape of this period looked considerably different, and telling the story of this decade's shopping honestly means acknowledging that difference rather than only repeating the story the advertisements wanted told. Black Americans in this decade, in the South by explicit law and in the North by unwritten but very real practice, navigated a grocery landscape that was separate, unequal, and in a great many cases deliberately hostile. Across the Jim Crow South, this separation was written directly into law. Separate entrances, separate service counters, stores where black customers were served last and served with visibly less care, in ways designed to reinforce their position within the broader social order as clearly and as constantly as possible. The gleaming supermarket scene in the national advertisements was, in a great many southern towns, a place black shoppers could enter only under narrow, specific conditions, or in some cases couldn't enter at all. In the North, exclusion tended to be less formally codified and no less real for it. Residential segregation, reinforced through restrictive housing covenants, discriminatory lending practices, and the coordinated decisions of real estate agents and developers, had concentrated black families into specific urban neighborhoods. Those same neighborhoods were consistently underserved by the supermarket chains expanding so rapidly out into the new suburbs. The new stores followed the new housing developments, and the new housing developments had, in many cases, been built with explicit, legally sanctioned intent to serve white families exclusively. The grocery store followed the housing pattern, and the housing pattern excluded. In practice, this meant black neighborhoods were served by smaller, more limited stores carrying fewer products at noticeably higher prices. The cost of feeding a family in a segregated northern neighborhood ran measurably higher than the cost of feeding an equivalent family out in the suburbs, because the competitive pressure that a large chain supermarket applied on prices simply wasn't present. Because the bulk purchasing power of a major chain wasn't present. Because the refrigeration and storage infrastructure that kept a supermarket's prices low wasn't present either. None of this happened by coincidence. It was the grocery store's own particular expression of a much broader set of policies and practices running through nearly every dimension of American economic life at the time. Black-owned grocery stores, in response, served their own communities with a dignity and resourcefulness the mainstream chains consistently withheld. They extended credit. They knew their customers personally. They stocked the specific ingredients their communities actually cooked with, rather than only whatever the mainstream food culture had decided counted as universal. These stores functioned as genuine businesses, and they also functioned as genuine anchors, the kind of institution a neighborhood quietly organized itself around, trusted precisely because the person behind the counter had a real stake in the same community he was serving. The supermarket in this decade reflected, in miniature, everything else happening across American society, its genuine abundance and its equally deliberate withholding of that same abundance, its modernity sitting right alongside a stubborn insistence on preserving very old hierarchies inside brand new packaging. The gelatin dessert looked the same color on every single shelf in the country. Access to that shelf most certainly did not. The grocery trip, of course, never ended once the bags reached the trunk. Dinner didn't cook itself, and this is precisely the detail that tends to get lost in the warm, amber-lit glow of nostalgia, the detail the vintage advertisements, with their smiling women and their gleaming countertops, consistently and quite deliberately left out. Coming home with 3 full bags of groceries at 2 in the afternoon meant you had, at most, a couple of hours before hungry family members started arriving home, and the actual cooking still needed to happen, and it wasn't optional, and there was generally no one coming to help. The kitchen of this decade was, admittedly, better equipped than the kitchens that came before it. A gas or electric stove offering genuinely reliable temperature control. A refrigerator that kept things cold without requiring manual ice deliveries. Perhaps a stand mixer sitting on the counter, if the household had been fortunate enough to accumulate the necessary trading stamps to claim one. These were real, meaningful improvements, but none of them made dinner appear on their own. Vegetables still needed peeling. Meat still needed browning and careful watching. A roast that looked deceptively simple on a recipe card still needed to go into the oven at precisely the right temperature at precisely the right time in order to be ready the moment the family walked in hungry, which meant working backward from when everyone would actually arrive home, which meant holding an entire external schedule carefully in your head that technically belonged to other people. The casserole still needed assembling by hand. The salad still needed washing, tearing, and dressing. The potatoes, unless they happened to be the instant variety, and sometimes they were, and sometimes that was genuinely the right call for a busy week, still needed peeling and boiling and mashing. The mashing itself requiring a hand masher, real elbow grease, and a small internal decision about exactly how much butter to use, and whether anyone at the table would actually notice if it was margarine instead. Dinner in this decade was never ordered through an app. It wasn't assembled from a meal kit with ingredients pre-measured into neat little packets and instructions printed on a laminated card. It wasn't picked up already prepared on the way home from somewhere. It was made from raw ingredients in an actual kitchen by a person who had also done the shopping for those same ingredients earlier that same day, while the rest of the household sat comfortably in the next room watching television. This isn't offered here as a complaint, and for the most part, the women actually doing this work weren't offering it as a complaint either, or rather, they largely weren't offering it at all, because the cultural vocabulary needed to describe it that way didn't really exist yet, and the cultural permission to use that vocabulary, even if it had existed, was further away still. They were simply doing whatever needed doing in the time available with whatever resources were on hand, drawing on the accumulated skill of someone who had done this exact sequence enough times that it had become close to automatic. The timing, the temperatures, the precise order of operations, without ever quite becoming genuinely easy. The cart had been full. The bags had been heavy. The refrigerator was stocked, the pantry organized, the bread tucked safely into its box, the eggs settled into their designated compartment, the canned goods all facing forward on the pantry shelf exactly the way they were supposed to. Dinner sat about 40 minutes away, and somewhere in the back of her mind, next week's list had already quietly begun assembling itself, because the list was always beginning again, because a household never really stops needing things, because this particular kind of work is continuous in exactly the way invisible work always tends to be. It only ever paused long enough to start right back up again. There was a real sense in which the supermarket of this decade functioned as the American dream made tangible, the post-war promise of prosperity, rendered edible, sellable, stacked in neat rows along shelves that ran the entire length of an enormous building, a scale that would have seemed almost unimaginable to anyone who had lived through the hardship of the previous 2 decades. Full shelves weren't simply full shelves. They stood as evidence, proof that the whole system had actually worked, that the years of sacrifice had genuinely been worth something, that the country had emerged from over a decade of depression and wore into something that looked unmistakably like real abundance. A generation that had rationed butter and sugar and meat, that had carefully kept its ration books, made its substitutions, told its children that powdered eggs tasted just as good even when everyone quietly knew otherwise, now stood inside a store where butter sat available in essentially unlimited quantity for around 70 cents a pound, with nobody checking a ration book at the register, because there was no ration book anymore because the war had ended, and this, unmistakably, was what winning actually looked like. The supermarket participated fully in a national mythology this decade was actively constructing about itself. The idea that America had genuinely arrived somewhere, that the long, difficult road from deprivation to prosperity had reached its destination, that the new life being built out in the suburbs, with its new cars and new appliances and gleaming new supermarkets, was precisely the destination history had been quietly working toward all along. A full cart stood as proof of arrival. A shelf of recognizable name brands stood as proof of arrival. A frozen dinner sitting in the freezer case stood as proof of arrival too, because arrival in this framing meant having genuine options, and options meant freedom, and freedom happened to be the single word this decade reached for most often to describe itself. This wasn't purely myth either. Compared with what most people in most countries around the world were eating in this same period, compared with a still recovering post-war Europe managing genuine scarcity, compared with a Soviet Union whose state-run grocery stores remained reliably understocked, compared with the vast stretches of the world where simply feeding a family remained an urgent daily problem that had absolutely nothing to do with clever coupon strategy, the American supermarket represented a genuine, remarkable achievement of productive capacity and logistical infrastructure. The mythology was built on something real, but the mythology also required careful editing. It required not looking too closely at the neighborhoods the new supermarkets had never bothered to follow. It required not examining, too directly, the budget math of the families for whom a full cart represented genuine anxiety rather than any real satisfaction. It required treating one very specific model of the household, the suburban home, the single male income, the woman who did all the shopping and all the cooking, as though it were simply universal rather than one particular arrangement among many possible ones, an arrangement maintained partly through the active exclusion of every alternative. The American dream, stacked neatly on a shelf, was real, and it was partial, and it was genuinely wondrous, and it was genuinely unequal, and every one of those things was true at exactly the same time, which tends to be more or less the situation with American dreams in general. You could push your cart through those aisles and feel the abundance and feel genuinely grateful for it, and still understand, if you were paying attention, that not everyone was pushing a cart through quite the same aisles. The cereal, at least, really was excellent. If you wanted to understand this decade without reading a single page of formal history, you could do worse than simply reading its grocery lists. The grocery list stands as a genuine primary document, unself-conscious, entirely unperformed, written for no audience beyond the person who was actually going to the store. It records what a household consumed, what it valued, what it could realistically afford, and what it quietly worried about running short of. It is, in a real sense, one of the most honest documents any household produces, because nobody writes a grocery list with an eye toward how it will read later. A typical list from this period might read something like milk, butter, eggs, white bread, ground beef, canned peas, cream of mushroom soup, shortening, coffee, gelatin dessert, sugar, flour, American cheese, bologna, a fryer chicken if it's on sale. Taken together, these few words paint a fairly complete portrait of a household that cooked largely from scratch while still welcoming genuine industrial assistance wherever it was offered, that treated fat as a fundamental ingredient rather than something to add cautiously, that valued reliability over any real sense of culinary adventure, and that maintained its pantry as something closer to a functioning system than a loose collection of impulse buys. That small qualifier attached to the chicken is worth sitting with for a moment. If it's on sale, 4 plain words carrying the entire weight of a household's budget inside a single condition. The chicken was wanted. It had been planned for. But it remained conditional, subject entirely to whatever price tag happened to be sitting on it that particular day. And the person writing the list understood this perfectly well, and wrote the condition into the list as a private note to herself, a reminder that the final decision would be made right there in the store, in real time, based on what the shelf actually said, and that dinner would simply adjust itself accordingly if the price came in wrong. Historians who study the material culture of everyday life prize documents like these precisely because of this quality of unguarded honesty, A dinner party menu is aspirational by nature. It shows you what a household wanted to project outward to guests. A grocery list shows you what the household actually ran on, week after week, when nobody was watching. The casserole was built from whatever sat on that list. The birthday cake came from that list. The Tuesday dinner, the Sunday roast, the packed school lunches, the after-school snack, all of it traced back in the end to that same list, to that same store, to the same woman sitting at the kitchen table on a Wednesday night with a sharpened pencil, quietly solving the coming week's food problem in advance, because solving it in advance was the only way it ever actually got solved at all. The prices scrawled beside items on any grocery list that happens to survive from this era function as their own small time capsule. Coffee at 89 cents, butter at 72 cents, a dozen eggs at 58 cents, ground beef running about 53 cents a pound. These numbers look almost impossibly small today, until you remember the paycheck they were pulled from, and then they suddenly look exactly right. Modest, familiar, the ordinary prices of things people bought every single week because they simply had to, budgeted for carefully because the budget demanded it, and considered entirely normal because, at the time, they were. The list also reveals plenty by what it leaves out entirely. No fresh herbs, no specialty cheese, no wine, no avocado, nothing that required a separate explanation or a special set of instructions. The list describes a style of cooking that knew exactly what it was and had made peace with the idea that this was enough. That the real goal was competence, reliability, affordability, completeness, rather than anything especially exceptional or adventurous. And in a decade where the hardship of the Depression still sat fresh in living memory, and the war itself had ended less than 10 years earlier, complete was never a low bar to clear. Complete was, in a very real sense, the entire point. The supermarket of this period was never really a fixed destination. It was, instead, one stage in a much longer transformation, a transformation the decade itself had set in motion, without fully understanding where it would eventually lead. The momentum it built would go on to carry the American grocery store into forms its early architects could never have predicted, and might not have entirely recognized if you'd shown them. By the later years of the decade, the stores were already growing larger, and the growth was clearly accelerating. Bigger parking lots, wider aisles, more products crowding into every single category, and not simply more brands of the same familiar item, but genuinely new categories of product that hadn't existed at the decade's start and would be permanent fixtures within another 10 years. The frozen food section was expanding from a single modest row of freezers into an entire dedicated zone of its own. Prepared foods were multiplying steadily. The produce section was beginning to receive better refrigeration, the kind that would eventually let it stock items that simply couldn't have survived a single day at ambient store temperature in the earlier years of the decade. A health food movement was quietly gathering at the very edges of the culture, small, marginal, viewed with roughly the same mild suspicion as yogurt itself, but gathering nonetheless. There were people, by the later years of the decade, beginning to read about nutrition in ways that quietly contradicted whatever a cheerful soup advertisement had implied, beginning to question whether all that sugar in a children's breakfast cereal counted as a feature or a genuine problem, beginning to think seriously about what processing actually removed from food, along with whatever inconvenience it eliminated. They weren't yet numerous enough to be considered a real market. They weren't yet numerous enough that any store felt the need to stock a shelf specifically for them, but they were there, and they were growing. Meanwhile, the civil rights movement stood in direct, open confrontation with the very segregation that had defined so many retail spaces, so many residential neighborhoods, and so many corners of American economic life throughout this decade. The organizing and protests that would define the following years were, in their own way, also about grocery stores, about who actually had access to the abundance the country was producing in such enormous quantity, and on precisely whose terms that access was granted. The supermarket's cheerful advertising campaigns were about to run headlong into a country that was beginning, insistently, to ask exactly the kinds of questions those advertisements had been designed from the start to avoid. The housewife doing all of this weekly shopping was, within a few short years, going to start reading a certain influential book about the problem that had no name, or would be reading it soon enough, and would begin to articulate, cautiously at first and then with steadily growing clarity, the feeling that the domestic role the supermarket had quietly assumed she was playing wasn't necessarily the whole of what she actually wanted out of her own life. The cart, the list, the budget, the dinner, the entire ritual of shopping day itself, none of it was going away anytime soon. But the unquestioned naturalness of her being the only one responsible for all of it was already, quietly, beginning to erode at the edges. By the time the following decade rolled fully into view, the store that had felt so dazzlingly modern at the start of ours already felt just slightly out of date, the way familiar things always do once the world around them starts changing faster than they can keep pace with. The cereal mascots were still there, still smiling. The Jell-O molds were still turning up at the occasional dinner party. The bread box sitting on the kitchen counter was slowly gathering dust, as plastic bags and better refrigeration quietly made it unnecessary. The frozen dinner was multiplying into dozens of new varieties. The world kept moving, the way it always does, forward and sideways at once, in directions that look entirely inevitable once you're looking back at them, and looked like absolutely nothing in particular on an ordinary Thursday morning in the canned goods aisle of a supermarket in the middle of the century. Here is a strange, slightly uncomfortable thing worth sitting with for a moment. Some of what defined grocery shopping in this decade really was good, and we have genuinely lost some of it, and that loss is real, even though the thing we lost arrived tightly bundled together with things we are not remotely sorry to have left behind. Not the limitations, not the racial segregation and the systematic exclusion and the deliberate underservice of entire communities that came with it. Not the relentless, largely unacknowledged pressure placed on women to perform an entire domestic role without recognition or relief. Not the tuna suspended in gelatin. Those particular things are gone, and good riddance to them, and the long story of how they eventually went is one of the better stories in American social history. But something else went along with them too, something that doesn't have a single clean name, though the people who actually remember it tend to describe it with a very particular kind of wistfulness, one that's noticeably different from ordinary nostalgia. Not a longing for youth, not a longing for simplicity, but a genuine wistfulness for something that was actually lost rather than merely replaced by something better. The butcher who knew your name, not as a data point sitting inside some loyalty program's database, not as a username attached to a purchase history somewhere in the cloud, but your actual name, known because you'd said it out loud across his counter on 100 separate Thursday mornings, because your family had been coming to him since before your youngest child was even born, because knowing your name was simply part of what made him genuinely good at his job. And being good at his job mattered to him. The produce clerk who told you honestly that the tomatoes weren't worth buying this particular week, and that you'd be better off coming back on Thursday instead. The cashier who asked after your mother without ever having been trained to ask after your mother. These were the kinds of relationships the old neighborhood grocer offered as a matter of course, relationships the supermarket only ever imitated imperfectly, and that the modern grocery experience has, for the most part, stopped even attempting to imitate at all. A self-checkout screen doesn't know your name. An app on your phone won't tell you the tomatoes are wrong this week. The modern store is larger, less intimate, more precisely engineered, more thinly staffed, and the efficiency gains from all of that are entirely real, and the convenience gains are entirely real too, and something else quieter is equally real. Something that lives in the gap between a transaction and an actual relationship. a gap the best version of the old corner store somehow managed to bridge, at least some of the time. There was also a certain deliberateness to the whole ritual that's largely vanished now. The weekly shop functioned as an actual planned event, prepared for in advance, carried out with genuine intention, rather than the continuous, low-grade supply chain management that grocery shopping has quietly become for a great many people today. The daily glance at a delivery app, the same-day drop-off at the front door, the perpetual, minor restocking of a kitchen that never quite runs fully empty and never quite feels fully stocked either. The shopper of this decade made a single trip. She planned around it. She was genuinely present for it, in a way the modern, distributed version of grocery shopping doesn't especially ask of anyone anymore. Whether any of it was worth what it actually cost is a question this decade itself simply can't answer for us. The cost was real, and it fell on specific people in specific, unequal ways, and romanticizing the experience means being honest, at minimum, about exactly who was paying that cost and what it was actually taking from them. But the parts that were genuinely good were also genuinely good. And the people who felt the loss of it as the supermarket grew ever larger, more transactional, more perfectly engineered, weren't wrong about what they were feeling. They were simply feeling something entirely real, in the particular way people always feel something real when a place that once knew their name quietly becomes a place that no longer does. The last item has been rung up. The bags sit in the trunk. The receipt is folded into a coat pocket or already lost somewhere between the car seat and the door panel, in that small gap where minor things always end up going to become someone else's problem later. The week is stocked. The family will be fed. And somewhere, in a house that smells faintly of percolated coffee and something just beginning to warm in the oven, a woman in this decade is putting away her groceries. She does it with the quiet efficiency of someone who has done exactly this hundreds of times before. She knows where everything goes without needing to look. The canned goods go into the pantry, sorted into their categories, labels turned forward. The meat goes onto the lowest shelf of the refrigerator, wrapped in its white butcher paper, labeled in grease pencil in handwriting she's long since learned to read without thinking about it. The bread goes into the bread box. The eggs go into their built-in compartment. The coffee goes into the cabinet above the stove, exactly where the coffee has always lived and will apparently always live. There is a specific, quiet satisfaction in that reliability, in the small permanence of always knowing exactly where everything belongs. She has no idea what's coming. She doesn't know that in 20 years the very store she shops at now will have doubled in size and will carry 200 different kinds of cereal, along with an entire section devoted to foods from countries she's never even heard of. She doesn't know that her own daughter will one day order groceries from a small device carried in a pocket and have them delivered to the front door by a stranger she'll never actually meet, in a transaction that will take under a minute and require no driving, no list, no waiting in any line, and no conversation with another human being at all. She doesn't know about the avocado yet. Nobody in her kitchen tonight knows about the avocado. She closes the refrigerator door. She folds the last empty paper bag and tucks it into the drawer where the bags always live, because useful things get kept, because waste is a choice that circumstance has made genuinely difficult and habit has made close to unthinkable. She starts the coffee percolating. She glances at the clock. She begins thinking about dinner, which has, in truth, already been quietly underway somewhere in the back of her mind since the moment she woke up that morning. She drove to the store. She pushed the cart. She managed the budget, compared the prices, clipped the coupons, carried the bags, and put everything carefully away, and she will cook dinner tonight and clean up afterward, and the day will simply continue, and none of it will be remarked upon by anyone, because it is Tuesday, and this is simply what an ordinary Tuesday requires of her. But here, tonight, let's remark on it anyway. Let's give it a name. Let's hold, just for a moment, the ordinary, invisible, relentless competence of someone who kept an entire household running on a precise budget. inside a store deliberately built to exceed that budget, who fed her family well enough that the children grew tall and healthy, and the husband never once had to notice the effort involved, and the neighbors never noticed the effort either, and nobody noticed the effort at all, which was, by the strange logic of the era, the exact and only measure of success she was ever offered. Your own kitchen, right at this moment, is something close to a small miracle. Your refrigerator holds more food inside it than an entire medieval village could ever have imagined possessing. Your local grocery store stocks ingredients gathered from every inhabited corner of the planet. Whatever your own budget happens to be, it very likely buys more variety, more safety, and a wider nutritional range than any amount of money could have purchased back in this decade. The woman standing in that kitchen didn't have any of that available to her. She had a list, a fixed budget, a car without a single seatbelt in it, and a bread box on her counter, and she made it all work faithfully every single week. That quietly, without any fanfare at all, is genuinely remarkable. So tonight, drifting off in your own warm house, with your full refrigerator humming quietly nearby, and your grocery delivery app resting untouched on your phone, and your complete, easy indifference to whatever the current season happens to be for avocados, maybe offer a small, quiet thank you to the woman who wrote the list and drove the car and managed the impossible budget and put a complete dinner on the table every single night without ever once being asked whether she found any of it interesting. To the butcher who bothered to learn your name, to the neighborhood grocer who kept his lights on for one more year than made any strict financial sense, to the child who ate the same bologna sandwich every single day without complaint, and who eventually grew up and wrote a list of his own and walked into a store of his own and did the whole thing over again. Because this decade was imperfect and unequal in ways that took years to even begin to be named properly, and strange in ways that only really become visible with real distance. But the people living through it were stubborn and resourceful and quietly extraordinary in exactly the way ordinary people always turn out to be extraordinary, whenever the week simply requires it of them. The bread box is empty now. The trading stamps are long gone. The grease pencil handwriting on that white butcher paper faded away decades ago. But somebody, every single week, fed everybody. And that, in the end, turned out to be more than enough to build an entire world on top of. Good night.